Chapter 223. Grodin's face was stiff as he stood on the balcony, watching the torches converge towards a single point in the darkness. Ever since he heard that the damned Viscount Gaston had returned, he felt both regret and fear. He regretted that he didn't listen to his trusted aide's suggestion to force Viscount Gaston to stay. Instead, he was overcautious and lost a good opportunity. But other than regret, he was even more afraid. Even though he knew that the generals of Madara were in the city, and that those skeletons would not allow him to die here, he still felt an instinctive fear gripping his heart. It was like a sharp sword hanging high in the sky, and he could feel the chill on his head. He could not help but touch the wound on his cheek. Even though he tried to look calm on the surface, his heart was cold. He still remembered Brando's cold gaze and the words he said to him. "Keep your head, I'll take it another day." But he did not expect that it had only been a day since that day. The Baron turned his head. Behind him stood an unfamiliar guest. The latter was clad in black chainmail, and his entire body was shrouded in a long, black, winged cloak. He also wore a black metal mask, revealing only a pair of bright golden eyes. His sharp metal gloves held a huge scythe that rested on his shoulder, and he looked calmly into the distance. If Brando was here, he would have noticed the silver scale on the man's chest. Only one of Madara's generals had such an insignia. The Black Knight, Judge White. Tiamas. Chiou. One of Madara's 4 Knights of the Apocalypse. But he was different from the White Knight Ebden and the Red Knight Ladios. Tiamas. Chiou held a high position even before the First War of the Black Roses. He was Tarkus's right-hand man. There were many legends about him in the game, but the players were most concerned about his true identity. It was said that no one had ever seen the Black Knight's face under his mask. Of course, this was a bit of a rumor, because even the dead players of Madara had never seen his face. The Black Knight smiled at Grodin's flickering eyes. "My lord, you don't have to worry. Our army will arrive soon." His voice was slightly cold, but it had a neutral charm to it. "But I heard that the Viscount is going alone. His courage is commendable, but he lacks wisdom. He is only a gold-ranked warrior, and Cabias alone can easily deal with him. At that time, you can do whatever you want with him, my lord." As he said this, he thought to himself, is the enemy this time the young man who defeated Dead Maggot Meads? I'd like to meet him. Grodin snorted coldly at the side. He knew that Madara was unwilling to get involved in Awin's nobles' dispute. However, he wasn't displeased by the other party's suggestion. Whenever he thought of the trouble Brando brought to him, he could not help but grit his teeth and prepare a feast for the Viscount. Death is not a simple matter. The battle in the city was reaching its climax, and the mercenaries were advancing along the streets. Medisha took the lead, while Brando held Sifrid's hand and followed closely behind her. The young knight held Sifrid's hand as they advanced through the battlefield. Occasionally, a noble's private soldiers would pass through the defensive line and approach the young knight. The young knight was surprised that his guard was so lax, but he immediately got his answer. The young knight with a cold expression swatted away his sword with a wave of his hand, and then pierced the knight's chest with his sword. The entire process took less than a second. The knight's heart was still beating, but the wound was already covered with frost. The knight's sword suddenly appeared in front of his chest, and most of the noble's private soldiers fell to the ground with an expression of disbelief. Brando pulled out his sword and pushed the cold corpse to the ground, then continued forward. Sifrid's face was pale, but she still held on tightly to his hand. "Brother Brando saved me from the noble's horsemen," with the same cold expression. "That's right, Sister Amandina and the others. They're all good people, because only bad people would hurt everyone. Brother Brando's enemies are all bad people." Sifrid's young heart was filled with simple logic. Brando wiped the blood off her forehead and looked back. "We're close to AB's castle, but half an hour has already passed. Time is tight, but the enemy will probably continue to let us advance. Madara's undead should have appeared by now. Brendel looked around and quickly found what he was looking for among Grodin's private soldiers. It was not the skeletal soldiers or pale white knights that he expected, but the spirit terracotta. 7 spirit terracotta were hidden among the noble's private soldiers, and they were quickly approaching the castle. Their movements were so secretive that no one, including Medisha, noticed the killing intent hidden under the surface. After all, the Silver Fairy Princess's most familiar enemies were not these skeletons. Unfortunately, the spirit terracotta's movements were like a glaring light in Brando's eyes. He was too familiar with them. It was less than 10 meters away. The spirit terracotta's eyes flashed with a green light, and it looked like they were about to attack at any moment. Brando immediately handed Sifrid over to Cornelius, and while the middle-aged mercenary leader was still in a daze, Brando charged forward. He immediately activated charge. Everyone could barely see an afterimage sweeping past, followed by 7 consecutive slashes. The spirit terracotta's movements were like snow falling from the sky. Everyone could hear the sound of something being torn apart. Then, the scene in front of his eyes changed from still to still. The illusion created by the vision pulled apart the time difference. The 7 incomplete spiritual figurines were like trash, their limbs scattered in the air, flying back to where they came from. The noble's private soldiers were lying on the ground with the sound of 7 heavy objects falling to the ground. Brando retracted his attack and swung his long sword behind him. He was already standing in front of the mercenaries. At that moment, everyone was slightly stunned. Even though they already knew that the young noble was a gold-ranked warrior, they could not help but feel a sense of awe when he attacked without holding back. It was as if he had stopped there. The imposing aura of the huge army was forcefully stopped by this interception. At that moment, one of the crusaders suddenly moved. It let out a low roar, and the axe in its hand seemed to have been pulled out from the ground. With a loud bang, the stone slabs on the street cracked, and sand flew into the air. The terrifying monster had pushed aside the dozen or so soldiers in front of it, and swung its axe towards Brando. Brando looked at the monster without moving. He remembered that a few months ago, he was chased by the same monster in Bragg's auction house. But at this moment, the monster's movements seemed to be in slow motion in his eyes. The young man believed that he only needed 1 slash to split the monster into pieces. But he did not move. A silver spear had already passed through his shoulder, and in the blink of an eye, the sharp spear had repelled the axe with a clang. Not only was the axe repelled, but it was also broken at the base. The entire axe was sent flying far away with a metallic clang. It then fell into the crowd in the distance, causing screams. Only then did the mercenaries stop and look up at this gigantic creature. Each of them sucked in a breath of cold air. Although they knew that the undead of Madara were in the city, they could not help but feel afraid when they saw these legendary monsters with their own eyes. But the tall crusader was also at a loss. It looked at the broken double-edged axe in its hand, and then looked at the little silver elf girl between it and the young man. The soul fire in its black eye sockets flashed slightly. "My lord." Medisha frowned. She was also an undead, and the aura of the undead was familiar to her. But the pure killing intent of the other party made the silver elf girl feel uncomfortable. Brando did not answer her. The young man turned his head and looked in a certain direction on the battlefield. He saw the shadow move, and suddenly snorted coldly. He swung his right hand forward, and the black steel sword in his hand suddenly shot out like a bolt of black lightning in that direction. Clang! There was a metallic clang. The black steel sword seemed to have hit a wall of air, and sparks flew in all directions before it was sent flying. It hit the ground 3 times and slid for a long distance before coming to a stop. The young man's gaze did not move. He saw the air slowly move, as if a layer of translucent black fog was dispersing, and then a tall skeleton with a battle axe and brass armor was revealed. Pale yellow flames danced in Cabias's black eye sockets as it stared at Brando without moving. The battle axe in its hand had a deep cut on it, and it was obviously where it had clashed with the black steel sword. But Brando did not expect that a general of Madara would use an ordinary battle axe. He raised an eyebrow. At this moment, everyone stopped what they were doing. Whether it was the nobles' private soldiers or the mercenaries, they all stopped and stared at the skeleton general that suddenly appeared. Thanks to the War of the Black Rose, although the name Grim Reaper Cabias was not known throughout Erewhon, it was at least known to the upper echelons of Erewhon, as well as the entire southern region. There were not many high-ranking skeleton generals in Madara's undead army, but this Dark Lord was the only one with the title of Cunning. Also, its brass armor from 3 centuries ago, from the Cruz Lake dynasty, made everyone recognize its identity at a glance. Cabias. Madara's undead general, why is it here? Whispers swept across the battlefield like a black tide, and it was also like a bone-chilling wind, causing everyone to stop what they were doing. For a moment, both sides stopped what they were doing. The rumor is true. Cabias did not care about what was happening around it. The soul fire in the skeleton general's eyes flickered as it looked at Brando. You're proficient in dark magic, Brando sneered. A mere veil of darkness, that's all. The young man retorted. But he was secretly paying attention to his surroundings. The veil of darkness on Cabias was not simple, and it did not seem to be the work of a lich. He instinctively felt that Roscoe was nearby. Who are you, young man? Cabias asked with a hoarse voice. The copper dragon Reto's tricks might be able to fool your ignorant nobles, but not me. You're their true leader, aren't you? And the one who led the refugees from Fortress Redon to break out of the encirclement was also you, wasn't it? Young commander, Cabias raised its head and smiled. I've wanted to meet you for a long time, on this battlefield. As soon as those words were spoken, gasps could be heard all around. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 224. On the battlefield, gasps could be heard from the left and right. The noble soldiers and mercenaries stopped and looked at Brando in awe. The story of the copper dragon Reto had spread throughout the southern border, and even the northern border had heard of it. The year of flowers and summer leaves. The War of the Black Rose broke out. When Karsuk was defeated, Vil was in a state of emergency. The White Mane Army's flanks were defeated, and Grinwarsa's territory retreated. The Black Lord Insursta's invasion caused Randner to be in a precarious situation. The news of their defeat was not unexpected, but the citizens of the kingdom could not help but ask. Where is our army? Where is our victory? Where is our honor? What answered them was an indifferent peace treaty, and on it was written the fact that Butchie no longer belonged to the ancient kingdom. Silence followed. But there was a weak voice in the silence. This voice was telling the story, and it gently answered the hope in everyone's heart. In Fortress Redon. It was a flash of lightning in the dark rainy night. A large group of refugees was hurriedly advancing. They broke through the blockade of the Black Lord Insursta's flanks and killed the White Knight Ebden. They defeated Magus, Ladios, Gilab, and many other pursuers. It was as if they were a legend, and they appeared in front of the city of Brags. The person who led them was known as the Copper Dragon Reto. Brags became a sensation because of this. The southern border was also in an uproar because of this, and this name even spread to the northern border. It carried the name of a miracle, and it spread to the ears of the nobles and the idle conversations of the citizens. Reto was known as the one who brought about miracles. But now, the undead general who had personally experienced the war, the Lord of the Darkness, who was known as the God of Death, told them a different truth. The one who stood behind the copper dragon Reto was someone else. There was no reason for Cabius to lie to them, and there was no need for him to do so. The tall skeleton general's hoarse voice was filled with heartfelt admiration and anticipation. The pale yellow soul fire in its eye sockets burned as if it was admiring the young man. Just because of this young knight. Everyone's gaze landed on Brando at the same time. Why was he standing behind the scenes from the start? If not for Cabius, wouldn't his name have never been known to the world? The mercenaries and noble soldiers could not imagine that there would be someone who would refuse such a lofty reputation and honor. Of course, they could not imagine what kind of situation and choice Brando had faced at that time. They only saw that the young man's only reaction was a faint smile, that wasn't rejection, but disdain. Everyone subconsciously took a deep breath. It was as if they had experienced the state of leaving with a flick of the sleeve after the matter is done, and hiding deep in the name, at that moment. Who was he? Brando didn't say a word, but a mysterious halo had involuntarily descended upon him. For a moment, the battlefield was silent. It was a pity that Brando didn't know what the others were thinking, or else he would have felt lucky. It wasn't because he was disdainful, but because he was exposed by Cabius. He didn't know how to respond, so he maintained a smile on his face. "Cornelius, what are you waiting for?" Brendel shouted. The mercenaries were stunned for a moment, but they quickly reacted. Medisa had already leveled her spear and charged out from the left flank. The unicorn knight pierced into the enemy's formation like a silver stream of light, piercing through the heart of the tall crusader executioner with a single spear. The noble's private soldiers who had just found a temporary support were defeated in an instant, and they immediately fell back in disarray. The skeleton general stood in the midst of the chaos, the flames in its eyes flickering. It knew that Grodin's private soldiers were no match for the mercenaries, unless they defended the city. In terms of fighting will, the noble soldiers were far inferior to the mercenaries. One side was fighting for money, while the other side was fighting for their beliefs. The outcome of the battle was not difficult to predict. However, the outer city had already fallen, and it would take time to retreat to the inner city. This was the reason why it appeared here. There weren't many undead in the city, and it needed to invest its limited forces in the most crucial areas. For example, this place. Brando knew this very well. He had been a commander before, and he knew what the noble's private soldiers were like. He also knew Madara's habits on the battlefield. Moreover, he knew that the key to turning the situation around was to plan thoroughly from the start. In short, he couldn't give Grodin's private soldiers the time to retreat to the inner city. The young man's lips were pursed into a straight line. He had already seen through Cabius's plans, and it was like an open book. The two of them stood motionless in the middle of the river. However, Brando wasn't in a hurry. The mercenaries' vanguard was led by Medisha, and they could still press forward. He could afford to wait, but Cabius might not. He lowered his hands and looked at Cabius confidently, waiting for the moment when he couldn't hold on any longer. On the contrary, the flames in Cabius's eyes flickered. This young man isn't an ordinary troublemaker. When did Erwin have such an outstanding commander? In Cabius's eyes, even though the young man was standing in the middle of the chaos, he seemed to know the situation of the battlefield like the back of his hand. Of course, Cabius didn't know that Brando was observing the battle from a higher vantage point. Instead, it felt a deep sense of dread. No wonder Haku personally ordered me not to kill him. This young man's perception of the battlefield is comparable to Lord Insersta. If he was in Madara, His Majesty would definitely put him in an important position. Cabius's soulfire trembled when it thought of the Supreme Lord wielding the Mercury Scepter in the darkness. A long-lost feeling of excitement returned to its body. It was as if it had returned to the past. The memories pierced Cabius's heart deeply, but it also ignited its will to fight. As Brando knew, the tall skeleton couldn't afford to wait. The elven knight who had the same aura as Cabius was leading the mercenaries to go around it. If it continued this stalemate, the situation of the battle would be reversed. Cabius gripped its battle axe tightly, but it immediately felt an aura locking onto it. You're going to do it yourself. You're not going to recall the Unicorn Knight. Cabius thought. Brando's arrogance angered it. Yesterday, it had fought Brando once, and it knew that the latter's strength was only at the level of a gold-ranked warrior. I've heard that you're proficient in Erwin's White Raven sword style. The undead general raised its head and spoke with a hoarse voice. But young human, do you think that a mere mid-ranked sword style can withstand an elemental attack in a battle between gold-ranked and above? Brando smiled. If this guy knew that I'm not only familiar with the battle between gold-ranked and above, but also the battle after elemental activation and body reconstruction, I don't think it would be so arrogant to talk to me like this. This is ridiculous. No, it's like showing off in front of an expert. But at the same time, Brando activated Examine. This was a skill that the Silver Elves had developed after thousands of years of battle. In an instant, a series of data appeared on Cabius's body, and countless white lines extended from its body. The torso and limbs were dark red, indicating that its physique and strength were at least at the level of a gold-ranked warrior. The lower limbs, arms, and waist that controlled its balance were light red, indicating that it was at the level of a gold-ranked warrior. Its soul was so condensed that it was almost solid, and its willpower was unstable, but it was at least at the level of a silver-ranked warrior. Its intelligence was unable to be examined, and in fact, this skill could not be used to see what kind of skills the opponent had. But that was not important. In fact, Brando already knew what kind of special ability it had. He saw the white lines extending from Cabius's body, and he knew that it was a possible attack route. Prediction: this was one of the most powerful abilities of the Examine skill. When Brando tested this skill for the first time, he could not believe his eyes. It was only at that moment that he understood why he had never heard of this skill before in the game. Examine was an ability added to the Amber Sword, and the young man could almost imagine that it was related to increasing accuracy and dodging speed. Because the description of prediction in the game was that it was related to gaining insight on accuracy and dodging speed. It was normal for such a useless skill to not be mentioned in the forums. After all, most of the skills he knew were the famous ones. But here, investigation was given a completely different meaning by a freak combination of factors. It was a description of the enemy's attack route. Perhaps this was an ability that everyone in the game had, but here, only to predict could do it. Every move is in my eyes. Brando finally understood that Nalathar's description of the Silver Elves' battle techniques was not exaggerated at all. With this, one's battle prowess would increase exponentially. Before the enemy even made a move, one would already know the direction of their attack. As Cabius assumed its battle stance, the number of white lines that extended from its body gradually decreased. 5, 4, 3, and finally stopped at the 3 white lines that extended outwards. Brando was very familiar with this posture. It was one of the basic battle techniques of the Black Knight of Madara. The judgment of the examined skill was exactly the same as his own, 3 possible directions of attack. The young man raised his hand and used the White Raven sword style to create a gust of wind on the ground. The gust of wind on the ground picked up a steel sword that fell to the ground, and it landed firmly in his hand. It doesn't matter what you say, Brando replied. No matter how big your words are, it still depends on this battle to determine the victor. Cabius snorted coldly. Then let me test your elemental power, young human. Its body moved, and in that instant, its attack route was reduced from 3 to 2, and from 2 to 1. Brando had already appeared on that route. Cabius was stunned. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheatyin.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 225. Time Element. Brando had considered this possibility before, but the way the time element manifests itself was a little strange. Time. Seems like it. In the game, I've seen the time element before. No, it shouldn't be called the time element. It should be called the time element. However, it was also a legendary story of a shameless warrior who defeated a RMB warrior. It was one of the most popular legends among the players in the later stages of the game. He was fortunate enough to know everything about this existence. At least, he knew that the time rewind attribute was very similar to the situation he was in right now when it was under partial control. But whether or not it was completely the same was still up for debate. After all, the description of time element did not have words like stability. Brando sensed someone approaching him from behind. It was Scarlet. The red-haired girl was slightly injured in the previous battle. She limped behind him and silently unsheathed her sword and passed it to him. Brando stretched out his hand to receive the sword, but this time, he did not rush to attack. Because just a moment ago, his inspect skill, which had been activated all this time, notified him that a new, unfamiliar presence had appeared on the battlefield. Rothko. Rothko shouldn't be that strong. Is it a new enemy? Did they come to stop me from killing Cabius? Brando did not say a word as he looked at the skeleton that was struggling to get up from the dust. But after a few tries, it would kneel down again. It was obvious that it was heavily injured. He then looked at Cornelius and his mercenaries. They were under the command of Medisha as they drove Grodin's private army towards the inner city. You're here. Brando purposely made himself relax and did not look at the girl beside him. You knew. Scarlet raised her head and looked at him in surprise. She had followed him here alone, but from Brando's tone, it was obvious that he had already noticed her presence. She lowered her head in silence. She knew that this young man was very opinionated when it came to certain matters. She had already thought of the possibility of his dissatisfaction when she acted alone. She thought that even the lovable merchant girl would not be able to reprimand her, let alone her. She did not say a word, but made no attempt to refute him, as long as he did not blame Sanford and the others. She was used to acting alone. She was used to being punished. She was used to the feeling of not being valued by others. I noticed it when you followed me out. Don't forget that the container for the blood of God is still with me. Brando smiled gently. Besides, with your personality, I would be surprised if you didn't follow me. How could this be? The red-haired girl frowned and looked at Brando in confusion. What are you thinking about now? Brando's gaze swept the surroundings as he asked, still motionless. The red-haired girl suddenly thought of something and couldn't help but stare at the latter vigilantly. My lord, don't go looking for trouble with Sanford and the others. I will take responsibility for my own actions. What are you thinking? Isn't that the case? Scarlet lowered her head and asked softly. Of course not. I'm keeping you in the team because you're Sanford's friend. That's why I've never treated you as my subordinate. As for what you think, I respect your choice. Aren't we teammates? No, we're just not subordinates. Scarlet lowered her eyes. Brando did not turn around to look at her. He thought he could guess what this girl was thinking. If it wasn't for the Grey Wolves mercenaries, she would have been more willing to find a secluded place and wait for death to come. Protecting others was also protecting herself, but it became the link between her and this world. Makarov had hurt her too deeply, and no one would be able to make up for it, let alone an outsider like him. But as an outsider, he did not say much and changed the topic. Actually, it's not just me. Medisha and Cabius also know that you're nearby. The red-haired girl was stunned. Your life force is too strong, and you don't know how to hide it. It's as bright as the sun in the eyes of the undead. But it, Scarlet asked. Brando saw that Cabius had shakily stood up from the rubble, but he did not seem to have any intention of attacking. He only looked at Scarlet and said, "Kabia's axe was meant to force you out. I thought you could see that, I'm sorry." "It's nothing," Brando replied, "thank you." Scarlet was slightly startled. She looked at the young man for a moment before lowering her head again. Brando suddenly shifted his gaze away from Kabia's and looked at Medicia's direction. The silver fairy princess raised an eyebrow as if she sensed something. She turned her unicorn's head and raised her spear horizontally. The mercenaries immediately stopped. Even though their commander was still Cornelius, the Silver Elf's performance in the previous battle had deeply impressed them. Be it in terms of bravery or wisdom, even Cornelius himself had to admit that the gap between him and Medicia was too great. They originally thought that only Grodin's private army would participate in this battle, but now that Madara's army had joined the battle, they were at a loss for what to do. After all, the War of the Black Rose had just ended, and the fear of the undead army still lingered in everyone's hearts. Under such circumstances, they had no choice but to rely on those who could control the situation. For example, Medicia. And for example, Brando. "My lord." Medicia's voice sounded in his mind, "Are we not going to pursue? The undead still have reinforcements." Brando looked around. The aura that had been lying dormant on the battlefield had become obvious, but it was obvious that the enemy had not noticed that he had already discovered it. The young man looked in a certain direction and frowned slightly. The swaying black fog in the shadows caught his attention. What a high-level curtain of darkness. The young man's heart skipped a beat. "Medicia, be careful." Brando shouted in his mind, but it was too late. A black shadow had already shot towards the silver fairy princess on the unicorn's back. Asterisk bang. Asterisk the sharp sound of weapons clashing against each other was heard. Brando saw the silver elf being sent flying into the distance and landing in the middle of the crowd. Silver elf. After the black shadow succeeded in its attack, it let out a soft exclamation of surprise. However, it immediately retreated backwards like a black line that bounced off the surrounding buildings. After a few leaps, it finally landed in the middle of the road. Brendel finally saw the man's face clearly. The familiar black chain mail and cloak immediately made the young man suck in a breath of cold air. When his gaze fell on the scythe tightly gripped in the other's sharp metal gloves, his heart immediately sank. But what made his pupils contract the most was the strange metal mask that was laughing and crying at the same time. It was one of the 4 Knights of the Apocalypse, the impartial judge, Haku. Brando had expected that Madara and Grodin would send more people to the city after yesterday's conflict. But he did not expect that the one who appeared in front of him would be such a troublesome person. Of course, the title of the 4 Knights of the Apocalypse did not exist in this era. However, among the 4 of them, the strongest one was the Green Knight, Malphas, who was currently the commander of the Plague Wolves army. As for the one he did not want to meet the most, it was the mysterious Black Knight, the impartial judge, Haku. There was no other reason other than the fact that Haku was too shrewd. Not only was he powerful, but he was also an outstanding commander. With him here, Brando felt that his plan would be greatly reduced. He could not help but subconsciously look to the south and west. His plan would not be able to hide from this outstanding commander known as the Scales of the battlefield, but fortunately, perhaps this was his only fortune. The opponent he feared the most had appeared in the chess game he was most confident in. Otherwise, it would be a headache to meet this person at the end of a chess game. He could not help but tighten his grip on the hilt of his sword. His palms were covered in cold sweat, but he had already made up his mind to keep Haku here tonight. Kabias could be dealt with as he pleased, but Haku had to stay. Haku. Tiamas. Choyu. Brando forced himself to calm down and said, Madara's legendary Scales of the battlefield. It seems that Tarkus, who is missing an eye, values me a lot. He actually sent his deputy. The battlefield fell silent as soon as he said that. The title, Scales of the Battlefield, was not well known in Erewhon, but Tarkus Deputy was a title that reverberated like thunder in everyone's ears. In fact, the mercenaries who were helping Medusa up almost dropped their weapons when they heard those words. Cabias, Tarkus' assistant, what was going on? Why did a name that only existed in legends appear in this desolate place tonight? It was as if they were rushing to the market. It was especially so for Cornelius. The silver-haired middle-aged man was trying his best not to let his face turn even paler. He thought he was on the right side at first, but now he looked at Brendel, and he could not help but regret it so much that his intestines turned green. Regardless of which side it was, he shouldn't have gotten involved in it at all. The Black Knight was also startled. "It seems that you are very familiar with us," a magnetic voice came from under the metal mask. "Human, you are not Viscount Gaston. You are also not Brando from Bucci. You said that you are a Highland Knight, but even a wizard from the Black Tower would not know so much about Madara. It seems that our investigation of you has completely failed, human." He sneered, "But I have a personal guess. I suspect that you are one of the ancestors. Brando immediately heard Scarlet let out a soft "aw" behind him. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 226. Clang. The battle axe was forced to clash with the long sword. Both man and undead were forced to retreat after clashing head-on. Cabias took a few steps back before stabbing its battle axe into the ground to stabilize itself. As for Brando, he crashed into the crowd behind him. What kind of skill is this? The tall skeleton leaned back to regain its balance, and immediately shouted in shock and anger. Although it did not understand how Brando was able to see through its attack, it could guess what was going on. "A technique that will take your life," Brando coldly replied. Taking advantage of Cabias's anger, Brando stood up and slashed at Cabias with his sword. The inspect skill was unexpectedly useful, but it was also within his expectations. Only a skill like this was worthy of the title a divine skill in his heart. Even though Brendel's speed was fast in the eyes of the bystanders, it was as slow as a tortoise in Cabias's eyes. Only when the long sword was about to pierce through its ribs did it pull its hands back, preparing to deal a heavy blow to Brando. The white lines around Cabias's body suddenly changed and formed a new net. "My lord!" The silver fairy princess turned around and saw this scene. Brando also realized that his sword had missed. But a miracle happened. A figure like a flame appeared in front of everyone's eyes. Clang! The spear of lightning, Logos, suddenly appeared between the two, firmly blocking Cabias's pitch-black battle axe. At that moment, everyone saw a long, dazzling red ponytail fluttering in the night sky. The red-haired girl leaned back slightly, but she held on tightly to the hilt of her halberd to stabilize herself. Scarlet lowered her head, her amber eyes filled with calmness. On the other side of her, there was another loud sound. Time seemed to have stopped, and Brendel's sword accurately struck Cabias's right chest. The impact from the explosion created a turbulence in the armor behind the steel-like ribs, causing the air to swirl and break through the thin barrier of the skeleton. Cabias could feel that at least 3 of his ribs were broken. Then, it roared as it was sent flying. "That's impossible." This thought took root in the minds of Brendel, Cabias, and even the silver elf princess who was watching from afar. How is this possible? The 3 of them clearly felt that Brendel's sword had missed, and Cabias had dodged to the side, but when Brendel's sword came into contact with his body, they realized that Cabias's sword was about to hit him. Cabias's body was still in its original position. Was it an illusion? But Brando had subconsciously used all his strength to press down on the long sword, and a white frost spread out from his sword, forming a radiant curtain of frost in front of him. Cabias was sent flying by the icy wind, crashing heavily onto the ground. Along with its brass armor, it was sent flying for a few rounds before finally coming to a stop after crashing into a wall. With a loud bang, smoke and dust flew everywhere. There was a cracking sound. The long sword cracked, and then it shattered into pieces. Brando held on to the hilt, forgetting to continue his attack. What he saw just now was not an illusion. With his level 130 combat experience, he would not make such a ridiculous mistake in a low-level brawl. Did he see wrongly? Was it even possible for a level 130 warrior to do that? He threw away the sword hilt and pulled out another sword from a nearby noble's corpse. It was awkward to say that these common longswords could no longer withstand his gold-ranked strength. He missed the Thorn of Light very much. Although it was a low-level weapon, it was still a magic weapon. Cabias stood up shakily from the ruins. Although the previous attack was not enough to injure it, it was not in a good state. Brando had just stepped into the gold-ranked realm, but his strength was still at the level of a low-level gold-ranked warrior. When he used his full strength, not everyone could block it with their chest. But the undead general pressed on the wound on its chest, and it did not have the time to complain. In its vision, two figures, one red and one black, were closing in. This was a good tactic, but it was too slow. Cabias gritted its teeth and took a step back, raising its battle axe with both hands. It used all its strength to push forward, and two ear-piercing metallic screeches pierced through the battlefield. The mercenaries could not help but cover their ears subconsciously. Power burst. Brando did not expect the skeleton to be able to use such a move. By the time he reacted, Scarlet had already been sent flying with her spear. At the same time, he felt a huge force surging into his hand, and as he fell backwards, he could only watch helplessly as the blank longsword and Cabias' battle axe turned into countless metal fragments that scattered in the air. The young man immediately covered his eyes with his hand, and the metal fragments flew towards him and Cabias. Clang! 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 Brando felt a piercing pain in his hand. His clothes and trousers were also turned into sieves. But what made him even more shocked was that his strength was not on par with Scarlet's. Then why was the red-haired girl sent flying, while he was only knocked down and had his weapon shattered? Cabias did it on purpose. His eyes twitched, and he saw the tall skeleton throw away its battle axe. At the same time, a dazzling metallic light appeared in its claws. The undead general sneered, and in its claws was a short spear, thrusting towards Brando's shoulder. A layer of blood-red mist appeared on the short spear, and it moved forward like a straight line of blood. A magical weapon. It was too fast, and Brando, who was falling to the ground, had no time to dodge. Cabias used all its strength to stab downwards, and it could almost imagine the young man's miserable screams. But in the next moment, it found that it had stabbed nothing but air. The tall skeleton subconsciously raised its head. Brando was still holding his right hand with his left hand, and the silver ring of the Wind Empress on his right index finger was facing the ground. He smiled triumphantly at Cabias. In fact, when he first saw that Cabias's battle axe was not a magical weapon, he was certain that its main weapon was not a battle axe. He had been waiting for this skeleton to bare its fangs, but he did not expect it to be full of tricks. Just as the short spear was about to hit him, Brando decisively used the ring of the Wind Empress to launch a wind bullet at the ground. The huge recoil sent him flying. The impact of a silver-ranked warrior's attack was not enough to deal much damage to him, but it was enough to change his direction as he fell to the ground. Just like that, the tables had turned. Cabias raised its head, and saw Brando pulling out a short sword from his boot with a smile. While in mid-air, Brando used the momentum of his fall to slash at it. Although the tall skeleton was shocked and angry, its reaction was not slow at all. It immediately dodged and prepared to counterattack. But at that moment, the same thing happened again. Cabius clearly felt that it had dodged the attack, but when the dagger fell, it still accurately hit its bald skull. How is this possible? It was about to roar in anger, but a loud bang suppressed its roar, and the Lord of the Darkness was sent flying again. Brando used the momentum to roll and landed on the ground, before pouncing forward once more. He did not have time to confirm the strange feeling from before, and wisely chose to give up on using Power Burst, to avoid damaging the weapon in his hand. Cabius roared and rolled to the side, trying to get up and counterattack. But what made it even more furious was that even though it had rolled away, the short sword still hit it in its original attack path. In fact, everyone on the battlefield saw an unforgettable scene. The young man, Viscount Gaston, was the true leader of Leto and the others. Or rather, he was just a young knight. Holding a short sword in his hand, he swung it left and right at Cabius. It was as if Cabius had rehearsed his moves beforehand. No matter how the tall skeleton tried to dodge, he was still sent flying by Cabius's simple slashes. It was no longer a battle, but more like a father beating his son. However, was that undead really the legendary gold-ranked god of death, Cabius? Or is that young man actually a knight of the Holy Cathedral who is hiding his identity? A 20-year-old knight of the Holy Cathedral. Not only the mercenaries on the battlefield, even the noble soldiers who saw this scene from afar were a little confused. Dear Martha, who can tell us who this person is? However, Brando's terrifying strength caused Grodin's private army to crumble. What a joke. Gold-ranked existences could be suppressed by numbers, but once they activated their element power, they were already inhuman beings. In front of an inhuman being, they would only be cannon fodder to stall for time. No one was willing to fight a hopeless battle, and the noble soldiers who gathered for power and wealth were even more unwilling. After Brando's last strike, the short sword in his hand finally shattered. He watched as Cabius was sent flying like a sandbag and crashed into a building. He could not help but let out a long sigh and threw away the hilt in his hand. He had tried his best to use as little strength as possible, but the sword could only withstand 10 strikes in the end. However, he did not care about that right now. He was immersed in a strange feeling. Just like what he saw before, if 1 or 2 occurrences could be called an illusion, then what about 10 occurrences? But the problem was, be it Cabius, or even Scarlet, who was at the back, all of his attacks had clearly landed on the skeleton's body. Every single time, his sword would strike empty air, but in the end, it still landed on the skeleton's body. What's going on? He raised his head and was about to switch to another sword to continue his attack, but at that moment, he heard a mournful roar from the ruins in front of him. Damn bastard, this is the power of an element. What kind of element is this? Cabius's sorrowful roar reverberated throughout the battlefield. Brendel was slightly taken aback. Element power. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 227. An element. Brando had never heard of such an element before. Even though karma reversal, time reversal, and spatial displacement could all achieve similar effects. However, the first description of logic, cause and effect, is order, regularity, and time is only related to the relative motion of objects, and the process of reversal cannot be related to it by oneself. The gold element's power was uncontrollable, and it had to be controlled by time reversal, so time reversal could be ruled out. There were too many definitions of space, and space alone had several meanings, and it had a lot of intersections with time reversal. Order and stability seemed to be used to describe space, but space had countless subdefinitions, such as displacement, vector, motion, and even matter and spirit. However, spatial displacement was related to displacement, and had nothing to do with stasis or stability. As for the subtypes of elements, such as karma reversal, light refraction, curved path, and illusion, none of them could lower the temperature of the material world, let alone order and stability. Brando sensed someone approaching him from behind, and a faint fragrance wafted into his nose. It smelled like the leaves of a certain tree in the hills south of Erewhon, and he knew that Scarlet often wore such leaves in her hair. He did not need to turn around to feel the red-haired girl walking to his side. She looked straight ahead and unsheathed her sword, which she did not use often, and silently handed it to him. "Here," Scarlet said. "Thank you." Brendel took the sword and saw Cabias's towering figure standing up from the rubble with a clatter of rocks falling to the ground. The undead lord glared at them hatefully. Brando's elemental power made it suspicious. Its elemental power was soul force, which was used to strengthen its attack and defense. It was completely suppressed by the young man's elemental power, and it did not dare to act rashly. Even though the mercenaries under Metish's command charged towards Grodin's private army, Cabias could only stand there and face Brando. It was originally confident in its victory, but now it was even worried that the mysterious young man would take the initiative to attack. The skeleton pressed the wound on its brass armor, not sure if it could really block Brando's attack. It knew that the situation could not be changed, but at least it wanted to keep Brando here. "Do we defeat it?" Scarlet asked as she gripped her halberd tightly. Brando shook his head. He wasn't sure either. The elemental power was erratic and uncontrollable. On the other hand, Cabias was far stronger than him. It could afford to make a mistake, but he could not. If he misjudged the effects of his element power and allowed Cabias to seize the opportunity to counterattack, the price he would have to pay was not something he could bear. The young man had long put aside his life and death, but in his position, he had to be responsible for more people. Death was simple, but it was the choice of a coward. Its attack just now was to force you out. I thought you could see it. Brando replied. He was talking about Scarlet blocking the axe for him. "I'm sorry." Scarlet suddenly reacted and looked at him in surprise. You knew?" But she had clearly followed him alone. She was so far away in the forest. Besides, she also had experience in hiding in the forest. She clearly remembered that he was holding Sifrid's hand and walking far ahead without looking back. She suddenly shut her mouth and looked at Brando suspiciously. She suspected that Brando was trying to trick her. "I noticed it when you came out with me," Brando replied, "the vessel for the god's blood." "Ah." Scarlet lowered her head. In her eyes, this young lord was used to controlling everything and doing things his own way. Even the lovable merchant girl was not something he could reprimand, let alone her. But she had thought it through before acting rashly. She was used to being reprimanded, at least compared to being ignored. She took a deep breath and suddenly thought of another possibility. Is he trying to shift the blame onto Sanford and the others? The more she thought about it, the more she felt that it was possible. She raised her head and looked at him vigilantly. "What are you thinking about?" Brando could see the obvious suspicion in her eyes. "I'm taking responsibility for my actions." Scarlet frowned and said. "Responsibility?" Brando looked at the motionless Cabias. "Are you the one who can afford to wait, or am I the one who can afford to wait?" However, he wasn't in a hurry and simply chatted with Qian. But his nonchalant attitude made Scarlet think that he would take his anger out on the Grey Wolves mercenaries. She could not help but feel uneasy. She did not think that her actions would cause trouble for others. Scarlet gritted her teeth. Anything is fine. She was an orphan who grew up in a mercenary group. But she was also familiar with the rumors of the nobles. Brando was slightly startled and looked at her. Scarlet blushed, and even the tips of her ears were burning. She seemed to have used all her strength to say those words. Anything is fine. "My lord, but please don't cause trouble for them." "Ha! Isn't that enough?" Scarlet gritted her teeth and asked. What? Brando was puzzled. Them. Who are they? Sanford, and everyone else. Why would I cause trouble for them? Scarlet was stunned. She raised her head and looked at Brando with her amber eyes, as if trying to discern if he was telling the truth. Because, she realized that she had blurted out something, but immediately shut her mouth. Brando suddenly understood what she was talking about and smiled. With your personality, I would be surprised if you didn't follow me. Is that so? Scarlet asked in an almost inaudible voice. She turned her head away again. You make it sound like I'm an idiot. No, Brando shook his head. I'm just respecting your choice. Then what about the others? Scarlet's eyes flashed. Everyone has their own responsibilities and obligations. Just like how a person can be willful, but they can't be willful all the time. Brando replied, I respect their choice as well, but after making a choice, what's left is the responsibility of that choice. Impulse can control a person's actions, but the difference between idealism and naivety is whether a person truly understands what they have to pay for it, and what they are willing to pay for it. So I'm sure you won't choose to run away here, right? Scarlet nodded. She looked at the shadow cast by AB's castle and said fiercely, TSK, if you want me to back down in front of that scum, you might as well kill me, so, our attitudes are the same. Brando smiled bitterly, we're on the same side, fighting side by side. Why would I blame you? Scarlet lowered her eyes, in the end, I'm still an outsider. Brando looked at her and suddenly realized what she was thinking. Of course, he wanted her to become his subordinate. A gold-ranked fighter would attract attention no matter where she went. But this was not a bad thing. She could slowly integrate into the group, and their relationship would be more stable. He had never intended to give up on Scarlet, but using the other members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries to threaten a girl was not his hobby. So he just smiled. The battlefield was silent for a moment. Brando looked at Cabia's huge bony claws holding the short spear. Of course, from a normal person's point of view, it was no different from a normal spear. The soul fire in the undead lord's eye sockets was still burning. The youth knew that Cabia's had made up its mind to keep him here. He looked at the battlefield absent-mindedly and simply said, Scarlet. Yes. Go support Medisha, okay? Leave this to me. Scarlet nodded and raised her spear. She looked at Cabia's, who was shrouded in the mist, and took 2 steps forward before stopping. Just give orders. The girl's voice softly said. Brando was slightly startled and looked up. But the red-haired girl's figure had already disappeared into the dust-filled street. Brando was stunned for a moment before he smiled. He then looked at Cabia's again. Both of them did not move. While Brando and the undead lord were confronting each other, Medisha was in trouble on the other side of the battlefield. The mercenaries continued to drive Grodin's private army into the inner city. Relying on their superior combat strength and willpower, Grodin's unhindered attack was met with trouble as they approached AB's castle. This was the last line of defense for the noble's private army, but Grodin's soldiers were not the only ones standing behind the defense line. There were also rows of skeletons that glowed with a faint light under the moonlight. These skeletons were very different from the ones he saw in Butchie. Compared to the normal skeletons, they wore light leather armor, held short spears in their hands, and had short swords and small round shields at their waists. Each of them carried 3 to 4 bone spears on their backs. They stood quietly behind the defensive line, motionless. But in fact, in the short period of time that they had come into contact with the mercenaries, they had caused great losses to the mercenaries. If Brando was here, he would be able to tell that these undead were Madara's elite bone thorns. These skeletons were the assault team of the low-ranked undead, and were Tarkus's famous personal guards. They could even be called the high-ranked existences among the low-ranked undead. As a matter of fact, wherever they were, Tarkus or the high-ranking generals around him should be there. For example, at this moment, the female knight was standing in front of the knight with a huge scythe in her hand and a long black cloak. Among the 4 knights of the apocalypse, the most powerful one was the Green Knight, Malphas, who was currently the commander of the Plague of Wolves. However, the most taboo and mysterious person was none other than the Black Knight, the impartial Judge White. He raised his head, and the expression on his metal mask formed a strange symbol, but the pair of golden eyes fell on Medisha. "Who are you?" Medisha frowned slightly. She had fought with him before and instinctively felt that he was powerful. "Silver Elf." The Black Knight Eamon was slightly startled, and his magnetic voice was surprised. "You are with that person too. You are really unfathomable. He is neither Viscount Gaston nor Brando of Bucci. He claims to be a Highland Knight, but it is impossible for a wizard of the Black Tower to have such an understanding of Madara. In my opinion, he is more like one of the ancestors, ancestor." The Silver Fairy Princess was stunned for a moment. But Eamon raised his head. His eyes reflected a beam of fire in the south. That was a magic signal rising into the sky. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 228. A ray of magic light pierced through the darkness and rose to the sky. The light illuminated the vast land, and the edge of the light changed on top of the ruins, outlining the outline of the ruins of the south gate of Abes. The cold face of Vern, the leader of the Fire Lord, was constantly changing under the light. The tall man crossed his hands on the hilt of his sword, which was carved with the head of a demon, and stood motionless in the darkness. His heavy eyes looked straight ahead. The forest on the horizon seemed to form an inky line in the darkness, and the fog formed a thin layer of night mist. But on the other side of the darkness, a row of rustling footsteps gradually came from afar. It was as if the footsteps came from hell. However, it was a huge army marching forward in unison. The sexy and beautiful mercenary leader with fiery long hair did not guess it right. Vern had never become Erwin's knight. But there was a long scar on his neck, which came from his past memory. He was actually a retired cavalryman who fought against Madara in Karsuk. So when he closed his eyes, he could almost tell from the depths of his soul where the rustling sound came from. Madara's army was like an ocean, boundless and endless, an endless skeleton army. Rows after rows of skeletons' footsteps fell on his heartstrings. Sparks of red fire appeared in the darkness, and there were more and more of them, like willow, the wisps drifting behind the fog. The mercenaries picked up their weapons and stood up from the ruins with a solemn expression. More and more people gathered behind a temporary fortification built on the ruins. Heads moved about, but no one spoke. Their voices seemed to be swallowed up by the approaching drumbeats. Everyone held their breaths as they watched the scene unfold before them. The army of the undead slowly emerged from the darkness. Some people came to Vern's side. They were the subordinates of the Fire Lord. Even a few wizards in the Fire Lord were included. In the past, they had always acted as the brains of the mercenary group. But they were hesitant about whether this battle was worth fighting or not. The key question was whether they were willing to offend the young Viscount. But at this moment, when they saw the army of skeletons coming out of the darkness like a tide, they couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. That was Madara. The bright roses and thorns in the darkness represented an irresistible aura, as if everyone had to face the aura of death in the end. Leader. Under the hood, the Magus revealed half of his pale face as he asked in a low voice. Fern said nothing. Commander, there are a few thousand of them, he reminded in a low voice. Including the rest of us, there are only a little over 200 of them. What's more, there's no way we can trust anyone outside the group. Are we really going to fight to the death with these skeletons just because of a promise? Even if we have to sacrifice all of our brothers. Where can you escape to? I know their habits better than you do. This city is now surrounded on all sides. I learned a lesson in Karsuk: never try to guess how many undead there are, because there will always be more than you can imagine. The tall man looked back at him and said, I know their habits better than you do. This city is now surrounded on all sides. He raised his head and looked at the front. Although there are many of them, they are just low-level skeletons. They were just summoned from the graveyard not long ago. As long as we can hold on until the day comes, they will naturally retreat. Leader. Fern raised his hand and interrupted the magus. Our only hope now is that young lord. 2 gold-ranked beings are enough to lead us out of this encirclement. Send out a magic signal. Tell the young lord that in 2 hours, the Firelord mercenary group will not retreat until they are dead. The tall man waved his hand. Raise the flag of the Firelord mercenary group. Even if I die, I want to see it fluttering under the light of dawn. Humph. Since the young noble wants us to hold on until dawn, then let me see how the first ray of light pierces through the heavy darkness. Fern replied. He knew Brando's plan very well. If he can do it, I don't care if I am the leader or not. The Magi were stunned and looked at each other. 2 hours later. It was the dawn. The first ones. Medisha stopped and frowned. The girl held her spear and turned her horse's head. Every nerve in her body was tense as she looked at the undead general who stood in front of the defensive line built by the undead. He was wearing a black cloak with a silver scale drawn on it. He was emitting a cold aura from head to toe. She did not know why he would suddenly say something like that. But before the era of the first ones, there was a legend in the ancient myths. In the dark and turbulent era, the Azure Knight led the first batch of first ones out of the sanctuary and defeated the Twilight Dragon, which was known as the Final Calamity. Then, the Year of Chaos began. But how could the Lord be one of the first ones? Other than the dragons, the bloodline of the Golden Generation had long been lost on the earth and even became a legend. Even the descendants of the Silver Ones were known as proud existences before this era. And after the era of the Dark Dragon's rampage, the bloodline was scattered on the earth. Even the survival of the Silver Ones became uncertain. How could there still be first ones walking on the earth? Unless Brando was a dragon. But the elven girl immediately shook her head and denied this suspicion. Even if the dragon was just a newborn, it would not be as weak as the Lord. Although she thought so, the girl suddenly felt a little sorry for Brando. She blushed and quickly apologized in her heart. But she turned her horse's head and asked coldly, "Nonsense, what do you mean?" Haku raised his head. The cold metal mask was half crying and half laughing, but the pair of golden eyes under the mask made Medisha feel a little strange. The undead held the scythe motionless. The silver elf girl quickly blinked her eyes, afraid that she would be charmed by him. The masked man, one of the 4 knights of the apocalypse, laughed in a low muffled voice. "Just like what I said before, the meaning on the surface is as you understand." The Black Knight's voice was filled with a metallic echo. "Nonsense." Medisha looked around. The undead general in front of her was far stronger than she imagined. But when she stopped, the mercenaries' attack also stopped. The elven girl did not know whether to ask the Lord for reinforcements. Because of the battle between Brando and Cabius, the streets were covered in a thick layer of smoke. She did not know what happened behind the scenes, but she was worried that she would distract Brando. But in this stalemate, the noble's private soldiers were also not allowed to enter the city. Since that was the case, she might as well delay for a while. She bit her pale silver lower lip and said, "The golden bloodline has long been lost. How can there still be first ones walking on the earth?" Haku smiled and quietly replied, "Indeed, the first ones were golden ones. But Miss Elf, you have forgotten that there is still the existence of the fool. The silver fairy princess could not help but smile. The dark dragon. That's funny. You think the Lord is the dark dragon? What's the point of such a lie? No one will believe it. It's meaningless. Haku shook his head, but in Madara, there is a legend that says, the Lord of Darkness will return. He can see through the hearts of people and understand all things. You must have heard of this ancient legend because it was passed down from the black prophecy of the Myurnas. They are your mortal enemies, right? So what? It's nothing. I just met a witch called Babasha in Fortress Reden. Haku replied as if he did not care. You know, the witches are more sensitive to the power of darkness than the average person. The silver fairy princess shook her head, but you must have forgotten that the dark dragon was once our race's greatest enemy. Compared to the witches, I am more familiar with his aura. Not to mention, there is also a passage in the Black Prophecy that says, darkness will be born from the inhuman, and the glorious people will perish in the flames. The Lord is a human, a descendant of the flame King Gretel. He is the descendant of the glorious people. You can't deny this, can you? That's true. Haku picked up his scythe and nodded to himself. Stop trying to sow discord. Who are you? The opponent did not seem to mind that she was stalling for time. Medisha felt uneasy. She had decided to attack again. If there was nothing she could do, she could only ask for the Lord's help. A chuckle came from under the metal mask. I remember I said that my name is Haku. Haku Tiamas Chou is my name. I am the scales of war, the just judge of the hearts of people. The undead general put one hand on his chest and bowed slightly. You are the instigator and the instigator. Medisha said coldly. She raised her spear, but the opponent was faster than her. Just as she was about to attack, Haku lowered his head as if he had seen it with his own eyes. He held the scythe on his back and swung it forward. A black light swept towards Medisha. The fairy princess was shocked. She clenched her teeth and retreated, but she was still hit by the end of the attack. The black light collided with the soul barrier around her body and exploded into a dazzling light. The airflow swept in all directions. The mercenaries nearby all retreated. The girl groaned and was also injured. A very strong soul power. As expected of a silver elf's ghost. Haku looked at the soul fire shining around Medisha's body and replied. At the same time, he raised his hand. The bone thorn column immediately moved forward. They took out the bone spears on their backs and entered an attacking stance. At the same time, the mercenaries were still being beaten up by the previous attack. They did not have time to care about anything else. Medisha, who was holding back her injuries, looked up and saw this scene. Panic flashed in her pale silver eyes. She clenched her teeth and shouted, "No," but the undead general had already put down his hand coldly. There was a soft sound. The sound of the air vibrating echoed in her ears for a long time. A row of bone spears flew into the air. The panic in the eyes of the silver elf turned into determination in an instant. The little princess pressed her hand in front of her chest and shouted, "Tayuna." Ancient elf language, wings of the spirit. Her voice was like a string of pleasant chimes that penetrated the entire battlefield in an instant. At the same time, everyone saw the soul fire around the young knight's body explode in an instant. It was like a pair of huge wings that spread out. Once the soul power was spread out, it lingered in the night sky and formed layers of transparent hexagonal network against the dark background. In an instant, the entire street was under the protection of the fairy princess's wings. The bone spears fell from the sky and landed on the transparent crystal network. Every time they hit, there would be a burst of dazzling light. But almost every bone spear was blocked and turned into ashes in an instant. The mercenaries looked up. The flashing light shone on their faces. But no matter what, they knew that they were saved. Haku looked at the scene quietly. His golden eyes flashed, ancient silver elf battle technique. He smiled and leveled the scythe in his hand. After the soul fire spread out, Metasha no longer had any protection around her. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 229. Metasha did not think too much when she opened her wings of spirit. She was like a general protecting her subordinates. But when she saw the black-clothed undead general looking at her quietly, she realized that she had done something wrong. It stretched out its right hand and held the huge black scythe in its spiked metal glove, and gently placed it down. Haku disappeared from her sight in the next moment. The silver elf instinctively pulled her spear back, but it was too late. She looked up, and the radiance on her wings of spirit dimmed. It was a cold scythe that blocked the light, and a black ray of light was drawn from the scythe from top to bottom. Crack! The silver chainmail shattered into pieces and fell to the ground like flickering leaves. Rose-colored blood bloomed like a bright red flower. Metasha looked at the wound that extended from her shoulder to her lower abdomen in disbelief. Her face was pale. When the undead general landed, he reached out his hand from under his black cloak and grabbed her by the throat. He pushed her forward and threw the silver elf off the unicorn like a kite with a broken string. She fell to the ground with a thud. A cloud of dust rose. The dark knight landed on the ground at the same time. There was not a trace of emotion under his cold metal mask. He calmly swung his scythe forward. The crescent-shaped scythe cut out a perfect semicircle. The wind pressure was like a knife that swept out in all directions. The mercenaries who had come to their senses and wanted to help the female knight were sent flying. The mercenaries screamed and retreated. It was as if the scythe had swept through straw. When Haku landed on the ground, a vacuum semicircle with a radius of 10 meters formed around him. The unicorn stood in front of Metasha, but the undead general knocked it to the ground. He looked down at the girl lying on the ground. Metasha was lying quietly in a pool of blood. Her pale silver eyes were a little unfocused. The girl coughed up blood occasionally. The bright red blood flowed down her fair, slender neck and formed eye-catching red spots. The girl could barely feel her own body. She could only feel the pain spreading along her nerves. A kind of exhaustion gradually took over her mind. Her consciousness seemed to be fading away. However, in her darkening vision, the girls saw the cold mask magnifying. Haku squatted down beside her and grabbed her by the throat with one hand. "Metasha, you still haven't improved," Haku said. The silver elf princess trembled and coughed out a mouthful of blood. "Cough, cough, you dash," she struggled to squeeze out the words, only to see that Bai had closed one of his eyes, and the other was burning with golden flames as he looked at her motionlessly. Mind reading. Damn it, the girl clenched her teeth and focused. Her remaining soul energy sealed the space around her body like flowing water. Although mind reading could only read one's thoughts on the surface, it was still despicable. In the circle of upper-class wizards, only the filthy and despicable people would use such a trick. However, mind reading was widely spread among the dark nobles in Madara. Metasha was not familiar with these undead creatures who lived in the shadows. If Brando was here, he would at most laugh. However, the fairy princess was trembling with anger as if she was greatly humiliated. The scythe-wielding undead general shook his head. "Cough, cough. I can't." Metasha shook her head weakly as if she was trying to break free from the general's grip. She felt her consciousness fading away. Then, she felt a cold sensation on her neck. The spiked metal glove was strangling her throat, making her feel very uncomfortable. She knew she could not hold on any longer, but she had to warn her lord. Haku looked at her motionlessly. There was a kind of pity in his golden eyes. The silver elf fairy princess trembled. She immediately felt as if there was an invisible wall on the battlefield that bounced back her telepathic thoughts. Her telepathic connection with Brando was cut off. You. Cough, cough. Medisha coughed painfully. There are many ways to use the soul element. The undead of Madara have a lot of knowledge on how to use it. I am no exception. Haku held the fairy princess' neck tightly as if he was catching a bird. He replied coldly, soul barrier, absolute seal. In this space that I created, I can cut off all connections with the material world. If you want to enter or leave, you must have power that surpasses mine. Haku's voice stopped abruptly. He suddenly turned around. He raised his hand to block in a certain direction. A fiery red figure shot out like a flame from the ground. It was mixed with galloping lightning. Bang! Several long arcs of lightning flashed in the darkness. Haku groaned. However, Scarlet had already exchanged blows with his left hand with her spear. Then, she quickly retreated. There is another gold-tier existence. The undead knight stared at the red-haired girl standing in the distance and said, that young man has many capable subordinates. Let her go. Scarlet looked at Medisha in Haku's hand and gritted her teeth. Bailing snorted coldly. He threw Medisha aside and swung his scythe at Scarlet. The red-haired girl was slightly stunned. She felt that Haku had suddenly disappeared from her sight. But in the next moment, the cold scythe had already touched her neck. The cold aura of the scythe brought with it a sharp pain. Scarlet's heart went cold. When she rushed over from afar, she saw the scene of Haku and Medisha fighting. She originally thought that was Haku's true strength. But compared to this moment, she did not expect that he was actually holding back. This undead strength was beyond her imagination. According to the young man, this undead was at least at the peak of gold tier. In fact, only those at the peak of gold tier would be able to grasp the basic method of activating their elemental powers. But the spiritual barrier was invisible, so Scarlet did not know that she had missed the best chance to estimate Haku's strength. Scarlet gritted her teeth and dodged to the side to avoid being hit by the scythe's sharp edge. The moment the scythe touched her body, she let out a muffled groan as she was sent flying. Even though the attack was much heavier than Medusa's, the red-haired girl was still able to get up quickly with her hands on her shoulder. The Oracle's natural defense and regenerative abilities were far stronger than the weak elves. Haku was slightly stunned. He thought that his attack with 80% of his strength should have killed Scarlet. He did not expect her to get up as if nothing had happened. But if this Black Knight, one of the 4 Knights of the Apocalypse, knew that this girl with a long red ponytail was able to recover after being hit by Akman, a monster who had activated his elemental powers, and was lying down for a week, then he would have used his full strength in that attack. The moment the two of them exchanged blows, they left the empty space where Medusa was. This was undoubtedly the best opportunity, but the mercenaries were cowering after the previous loss and no longer dared to move forward. Scarlet gritted her teeth and looked at these guys, her amber eyes seemed to be burning with flames. However, the leader of the Rose and Wine mercenary group, Cornelius, was currently hesitating. His slender silver hair was covered in sweat. The enemy's strength was beyond his imagination, and his confidants were also advising him to leave. But that young man was not someone to be trifled with. Not only was he a descendant of a noble, but he also had many gold-ranked fighters under him. No one would believe that he did not have a strong background. However, when he raised his head, he immediately saw the elite skeleton spear-throwers under the command of the undead knights. They began to surround the heavily injured Medusa in the center of the battlefield. The undead were like a tide. Cornelius gritted his teeth and finally made up his mind. If they disobeyed Brendel's orders, they might be killed, but now they had to face a more realistic threat. The undead were obviously stronger, and the masked Black Knight had injured Medusa and Scarlet. That was a fact that everyone had witnessed. He sheathed his sword and was about to give the order to retreat, but just as he was about to take a step back, he felt his clothes being grabbed by a small hand. It was the little girl. The silver-haired middle-aged man lowered his head and saw Siffred looking at him with a pair of deep emerald eyes. "Uncle?" she asked in a small voice. Cornelius was startled. He knew what Siffred was trying to say. But how should he answer her? Should he tell her that his uncle was preparing to escape? He opened his mouth, but found that he could not say anything. Siffred's serious expression reminded him of his daughter. His wife and daughter had died in the chaos. Erewhon's borders had been chaotic for decades, and almost everyone who lived there had experienced the hardships of war. The middle-aged man closed his eyes, his forehead covered in cold sweat. "Leader?" his confidant asked. Cornelius opened his bloodshot eyes. "Let's take a gamble." Everyone around him was stunned. "Let Martha win or lose," Cornelius said through gritted teeth. "Let Martha win or lose." The mercenaries finally made their move. They charged forward and collided with the rows of skeletons. The battle began in an instant. The mercenaries who were closest to Medusa immediately formed a human wall to protect the elven princess. They helped her up from the pool of blood. Medusa shook her head as she realized the situation she was in. But she immediately remembered that she still had one last chance to change the situation on the battlefield. Medusa took a deep breath. Scarlet and Haku crossed paths. When she was wounded for the third time, she suddenly heard the mercenaries shouting at her from behind. The red-haired girl stubbornly wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth. When she turned around, she heard the mercenaries shouting at her, "Attack that guy with all your might. Attack with all my might." What do they mean? Scarlet was stunned for a moment, but she quickly saw Medusa sitting in the middle of the crowd. The silver fairy princess's eyes were almost unfocused, but there was a glimmer of hope burning in her eyes. She immediately understood what they meant. Attack with all my might. She raised her halberd, and a dazzling arc of light appeared at the tip of the lightning spear. The red-haired girl brandished her halberd and blocked the approaching undead knight. Haku was stunned. Scarlet leveled her halberd, and in an instant, countless lightning bolts appeared around her body. Even her red ponytail was disheveled, and her hair fluttered in the wind. She stared at the undead knight, revealing her canine teeth as she chuckled. The lightning around her body immediately coiled around her halberd. Seventh string, Sound of Thunder. Author's note: I've been waiting for a long time for this novel to be promoted. I hope that my fellow students will support me. Please praise me in the comments section. Chapter 230. The intense flash of light even penetrated the barrier formed by Brendel's soul force, causing the entire space to tremble. Thunder rumbled, and a ring of electricity swept out in all directions. With a crackling sound, the young man who was facing off against Cabius suddenly felt something strange. He lowered his head and saw the hairs on his coat standing up. When he looked up again, he saw arcs of electricity appearing and disappearing on his black coat, the streets, and even the buildings and ruins on both sides of the street. Blue and white sparks extended along all the electrical conductors, creating a crackling sound. Brando was startled, and he instinctively felt that something was wrong. He looked back, but the mist in front of him was still calm. However, the strange silence made him feel a sense of vigilance. He walked forward, and as he moved, Cabius moved as well. A huge skeleton emerged from the ruins and blocked his path. Brando looked up and glanced at the skeleton. "What's wrong? Haven't you learned your lesson yet?" Cabias cracked open its jaws and laughed. Why don't you try? The young man's face darkened, and with a clang, he unsheathed his sword. It was Scarlet's sword, but it felt lighter in his hand. Even so, the action of unsheathing his sword forced Cabias to take a step back. It could be seen that this undead lord was very wary of his strange element, but he was still determined to keep him here. Brando frowned. Cabias's cunning was far beyond his expectations. Without knowing what was happening in front of him, he did not dare to attack recklessly. He did have a white deer statue that he could use for reconnaissance, but Necromancer Rothko was much more proficient in magic than he was. He was afraid that he wouldn't be able to win if he played such tricks in front of Rothko. Why hasn't Medisha reported the situation? Brando cast his senses forward, but there was no response. It was as if he was looking into the mist. He took a deep breath, and at that moment, a familiar, weak voice sounded in his mind. My lord, time is limited, so I'll keep it short. There is also an undead general who is very strong. Cough cough. His name is Bai. This was Medisha's voice. But his voice stopped abruptly. White? This name made Brando's mind explode. Why was this guy here? When he thought of the cold metal mask behind that name, the hair on his back stood on end. If he guessed correctly, there was only one person in Insursta's camp who would be addressed in such a manner, and that was one of the 4 knights of the Apocalypse, the Black Knight, the Judge, Ba. Tiamas. Chiou. But this guy was Tarkus' deputy. Shouldn't Tarkus and Madara still be fighting Erwin's southern army further south? What was going on? If it was just an alliance with Grodin or Count Randner, there would be no need for such an important figure to appear. What are these damned undead plotting? Countless thoughts flashed through Brando's mind. Bah! Ai's appearance had caught him off guard, but he was still able to maintain his composure on the surface. He raised his head and glared coldly at Cabias, then walked closer with his sword in hand. The yellow soul fire in the skeleton's eye sockets flickered. It did not understand why Brando suddenly became so impulsive. However, it only had one mission, and that was to stop this young man. Cabias's body was slightly hunched, but it had already gripped the short spear in its claws tightly. Brando gritted his teeth in the face of this troublesome fellow. Now that the situation had changed, he did not have the time to tangle with this fellow. He spoke coldly, Cabias, if you still want to return to the Hill of the Dead to manage your own territory, I'll give you one last chance. In a moment of desperation, Brando did not hesitate to call out Cabias's background. Cabias's eyes flickered, are you familiar with us? Brando acted as if he did not hear it and casually threw his sword to the ground. Clang! The young man raised his head and stared at Cabias without saying a word. It was as if he was looking at an inanimate object. Cabias cracked open its jaws and sneered, what, young human, are you thinking of surrendering? Cabias, you fool, be careful, Rothko's voice came from the side of the street. What? Be careful, he's emitting magical waves. The young necromancer reminded. Cabias was stunned and could not help but stare at Brando, who was motionless. However, while it was on guard against the sudden attack, it stretched out its bony finger and pointed forward. You're saying that not only is this young man in his early 20s a gold-ranked swordsman, he's also a sorcerer. Rothko, have you become an idiot from studying necromancy? The tall skeleton asked in a mocking tone. Rothko's voice fell silent. In fact, even he himself felt that it was impossible. Because even the chosen one could never be perfect in every aspect. Some people might be talented, but their time was always limited. A gold-ranked swordsman in his early 20s with the status of a necromancer was simply a fantasy. Perhaps only the sages from the War of the Holy Saints could have such strength. But what kind of existence were the sages? Flame King Gretel, Wind Empress Saint Hassol, High Priest Fanzan, and Saint Eloranta. These were the 4 sages who led the various races to defeat the Dark Dragon in the War of the Holy Saints. Which one of them was not a true ruler? Even the eternal King Loki, who held the Mercury staff and ruled Madara, could only bow his head in front of these sages. Whether it was in terms of strength or reputation, Loki could not compare to them. What Rothko and Cabias did not know was that the magical waves emitted by Brando did not come from a necromancer. It came from a planeswalker. Brendel lowered his eyelids and silently searched his elemental pool. In fact, since the first time he opened his elemental pool basically did not change: 10 slots for the fire element, 8 for the other elements, and still no light or darkness element. Looking at this half-crippled elemental pool, the youth could not help but sigh inwardly. With such meager strength, there was no way he could change the situation. Brando closed his eyes and let out a long sigh. In that case, there was only one way left. At the same time, when Cabias saw Brando standing there motionlessly with his eyes closed, it did not take the initiative to attack. Instead, it took a small step back. In the previous battle between the youth and it, the strange elemental energy had left a deep psychological shadow on the tall skeleton. Although the undead did not have emotions like fear, they did not have the habit of taking the initiative to teach their opponent a lesson. Especially for a high-ranking undead lord like Cabias. First of all, the honor of the Dark Nobles did not allow it to do so. Mana is gathering, Cabias. Rothko could not help but speak up. The mana surrounding Brando had already broken through the limit of an intermediate wizard and was heading straight for a high rank. It was about to break through the boundary between iron and silver. Cabias made a cracking sound from its chest and replied in a bad mood, "I know, I can feel it too. Don't worry." Indeed, a silver-ranked wizard was nothing to worry about. However, a gold-ranked swordsman and a silver-ranked wizard at the same time. Such a scene caused the undead duo to be at a loss for words for a moment. Rothko even suspected that it was a mistake for them to come here and cause trouble for this youth. His potential was limitless. He could not believe that he was able to witness the birth of such a genius with his own eyes. However, Brando finally opened his eyes. His light brown pupils were calm, and at that moment Rothko and Cabias could feel that the youth's aura had changed. It was no longer the cold aura of an elemental essence, but a state that encompassed all things. 4 o'clock. The people of Mauritania call it the dark slumber. It is the time when all things are resting. Brando raised his eyelids and looked at the tall skeleton general. If I remember correctly, the undead call it the midnight day. It is the time of the day when the power of darkness is at its strongest. Did I say anything wrong, Cabias? Ha! Cabias gripped the short spear in its hand tightly and made a meaningless sound from its chest. It's nothing, Brando shook his head. I just want to say that before the sun rises, the world is indeed dark. He raised his hand and threw a card forward. Although it was empty in the eyes of Cabias and the others, it was as if Brando had really thrown out a card that shone with the light of fate. However, the darkness is also beneficial to me. The card fell to the ground. Card of Fate, Mercenaries of Lopez, discarded back into the deck and reset into the field. The wind elemental pool was emptied in an instant. Then, under the shocked gazes of Cabias and Rothko, 12 mercenaries appeared along with 12 magic circles on the street. The mercenaries of Lopez who had just entered the field looked at each other, not understanding what was going on. However, the Nightsong Tiger was the first to react. He immediately asked in his mind, "My lord, what happened? Did you reset your deck?" Brando nodded. But Cabias's gaze swept across the mercenaries one by one, the soul fire in its eyes flickering slightly. "I didn't expect you to be a summoner, young human. With the strength of a silver-ranked, you can summon 12 iron-ranked creatures at once. I have never seen such a summoning spell before. You are not an ordinary person, Brando, or Viscount Gaston. But the tall skeleton changed the topic and asked in a hoarse, deep voice, "Do you really think that you can change the tide of the battle just because you have 12 more iron-ranked combatants?" Cabius shook its head and sneered. But the young man did not seem to hear its words. He already had a plan in mind. He turned around and looked at the Wild Elf sisters. P.S. Students, please support more vigorously. This is a rare opportunity to get a promotion equals. Smiley face, to be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 231. In the laws of all things, from 2 to 6:00 in the day, the people of Mauritania called it the dark slumber. It symbolized the slumber of the land and the world. However, the planeswalkers called it the rest phase. It was the last phase of the day for the planeswalkers. During this phase, the planeswalkers shuffled their cards back into their deck, calculated their mana, and rearranged their battle tactics. The planeswalkers' rules, Falerne. Brando's gaze fell on the Wild Elf sisters. "My lord, is there something you need?" Falerne was slightly startled. She then looked at her lord with vigilance. Her emerald green eyes carried a lukewarm and distrustful expression as she replied. "Let your elemental pool resonate." "What?" "Activate elemental resonance." Brando repeated with a serious expression. "My lord, the Wild Elf sisters and Rothko, who was hiding in the shadows, were all startled. In fact, activating elemental resonance was not a big deal. On the contrary, every elven teacher would deliberately let their elemental pools resonate with the next generation of elementalists, so that their students could experience the so-called harmony between the elements. This was the only way to deepen the affinity between the new elementalists and the 6 elements. But other than that, elemental resonance was useless. Then what was he trying to do? Falerne, Tia, and Rothko were all stunned. The only possibility they could think of was that Brando wanted to become an elementalist on the spot. However, this was undoubtedly a fantasy. Becoming an elementalist was not as simple as gaining the approval of the 6 major elements. In fact, being an elementalist was the same as being a wizard. It was a systematic and complicated subject. Without a long time of study, a layman would not be able to take shortcuts to become an elementalist. Thinking of this, the elder Wild Elf sister could not help but look at Brando with a troubled expression. The younger Wild Elf sister was even more direct, and she asked in a crisp voice, "My lord, your idea is a little unrealistic." Tia, the elder Wild Elf sister, ground her teeth. But Brando did not have the time to explain to them. He looked at Cabias, who was standing not far away, and calmly replied, "Listen to me, Falerne." Falerne nodded with a troubled expression. She closed her eyes and silently let her elemental pool boil. Although elemental resonance did not affect the user, it would cause the stored elemental pool to evaporate into thin air, especially on the battlefield. But since it was her lord's order, she had no other choice. But at the same time, a line of green text appeared in front of Brendel's eyes. "Detected instructor system. Would you like to take on a part-time role? Please wait." He opened up his EXP system and said, "That's right. XP, 64420, Commoner level 1, Militia level 6, 0/200, Mercenary level 26, for 75555537, the 54989 EXP that he had saved from the perfect storyline reward had now been reduced to 64,420 EXP after a day of continuous battles. But when the young man saw the number, he hesitated. He was well aware that if he thought about it, it would mess up his original plan. At the very least, the EXP he had accumulated for the second talent mission would vanish into thin air, and there was no telling how long it would take him to gather it again. After all, the reward of a perfect storyline was something that could only be chanced upon and not sought. However, he had no other choice. He had already made this decision before he came here. Brando opened the experience lock system. The green text changed in front of his eyes. Please distribute your experience. Level up Scholar to 15. Scholar level increased to level 15. The first free part-time position has been opened. A part-time elementalist. Do you want to use the free part-time job option? Yes. The moment Brendel nodded, the elder of the Wild Elf sisters, Falerne, opened her eyes. Her wide emerald eyes were like beautiful emeralds, and she looked at Brando in disbelief. The younger sister, Dia, covered her mouth in an exaggerated manner, looking at Brando as if he was a monster. On the other side, the young necromancer who was hiding in the shadows coughed loudly, and he almost slipped and fell out of the alley. What's wrong? Rothko, you bastard. What's going on? Cabius finally realized that something was wrong, and it couldn't help but roar. But it wasn't a necromancer, nor was it an elementalist. It couldn't feel the restlessness of the 6 elements that permeated the night air. It was as if they were lingering, filled with a sense of uneasiness and joy. They lingered around Brando's body, cheering for the birth of a new elementalist in the land of Woned. An elementalist, an enforcer of the laws of the elements. The most unbreakable ally of the 4 elven kings. Just like what Brendel saw at this moment, rows of ghostly green words began to change in his vision. Elemental contract established. Elemental resonance frequency adjusted. Spellcaster's hidden attribute bloodline revealed. Part-time job successful. When the text faded away, Brando seemed to have been pulled back to reality. All that was left in his vision were the Wild Elven sisters. Pharaoh opened her mouth, and she looked at Brando with a complicated expression, as if she was struggling to speak. Congratulations, my lord. Welcome to the world of elementalists. This is unbelievable, my lord. Dia looked at Brando with sparkling eyes, as if she had discovered a new continent. There was curiosity and blind worship in her eyes. Wait. The Nightsong Tiger interrupted them. You're saying? He turned around and looked at Brendel with a strange expression. But Pharaoh only nodded. There was complete silence. That's impossible. Cabius could no longer hold back and shouted, breaking the silence. It even took a step forward and stomped on a stone floor. Rothko, do you know what kind of joke you're making? No one can become an elementalist just by sensing the elemental resonance, unless the elemental Emperor Tumen is reborn. But my lord, I'm not joking. This is just... Rothko slapped his forehead helplessly. If he did not see it with his own eyes, he would not have believed it. At this point, they suddenly stopped and looked at the young man without saying a word. The tall skeleton lord was stunned for a long time before it managed to squeeze out a retort. Perhaps this is unbelievable, but young human, what's the point of doing this? Could it be that you think I'll be frightened by this and make way for you? What can a newly promoted elementalist do? Although it said so, there was a trace of uncertainty in its tone. Because who knew if this damned young man would come up with something else? But Brando only glanced at it. He lowered his eyelids and silently checked his stats. After becoming an elementalist, his elemental pool had increased by 2 slots, and his fire elemental pool had increased by 3 slots. His light and dark elemental pools had also been opened, each with 2 slots. This was not out of Brando's expectations. It was much lower compared to the players. But it did not matter, this was just the first step. Because for this night, the show had just begun. Brando opened up his experience lock for the second time. He paused for a moment and immediately pointed to the elementalist class he had just obtained. Elementalist Level 1, Experience Requirement, 6, Agree. Elementalist Level 2, Experience Requirement, 10. Agree. Elementalist Level 10, Experience Requirement, 610. Pharaoh's face suddenly changed. How? How is this possible? She looked at Brando blankly and almost blurted out. But if she was in disbelief before, this wild elf young lady suspected that she was dreaming at this moment. Brando's rapidly increasing elemental density was like a myth, weaving a strange dream. She never thought that an elementalist could increase his strength so quickly. No, this was not just a matter of fast speed. This was simply like sitting on a rocket. Unless it was God's chosen, it was impossible for anyone to reach the heavens in a single step. But God had long since disappeared from the earth. Martha above, the girl could not help but groan in her heart. What was going on? But Brando did not seem to care about the feelings of the people around him, because his level was increasing step by step. Elementalist Level 17, Experience Requirement, 4620. Elementalist Level 18, Experience Requirement, 6333. Elementalist Level 22, Experience Requirement, 12870. When he reached Level 22, Brando's thoughts finally stopped. He looked at the remaining 300 experience points in his pool and lightly sighed. It was a pity that the main attributes of an elementalist were willpower, bloodline, and wisdom. Otherwise, at level 22, his character's level would have increased. His original attributes of strength, dexterity, and vitality might have directly broken through the elemental barrier and entered the elemental awakening stage. Of course, since he had chosen to take this step, he would not regret it. Moreover, it was not like he did not gain anything. He looked at his elemental pool. Fire elemental pool 37 slots, other elemental pools 32 slots, light and darkness elemental pools 24 slots. Brando raised his head and looked at Cabias. The peak of iron rank. The tall undead lord gritted his teeth as he spoke. That's it. That's it. Cabias finally let out a sigh. Cabias let out a long sigh. It was almost worried that this young man would break through his elemental barrier right in front of it. Although it seemed impossible, when something even more impossible had happened, there was nothing impossible in this world. Moreover, in Cabias's eyes, this youth in front of it was undoubtedly an existence that could make the impossible possible. But fortunately, this world was still a reality. The undead lord could not help but shed tears of gratitude. But Brando looked at it and said, "Do you still remember what I said before?" "What?" "I said that if you still want to return to the Hill of the Dead to manage your territory, I'll give you one last chance." Cabias was stunned. It subconsciously turned around and saw Rothko running away. "Rothko, you bastard, what are you doing?" Cabias could not help but roar. But when it turned around again, it saw that the human who had been confronting it all this time had put his hand into his bosom and took out a book. It was a book with a black cover. "But it's a pity that you won't have the chance," Brando said. Cabias. P.S. Third update. Chapter 232. Brando flipped open the book. Page 17, line 2. His slender fingers stopped there. Unlocking this card requires 100 points of wealth. The book replied. A card appeared in his hand. Brando lowered his head and replied, "Unlock." Because he had given up on summoning Metasha, a third of the 318 points of wealth he had accumulated over the past month was gone. The young man raised the card and placed it in front of him, starry sky reflection, mysterious and complicated. He pressed his index finger, thumb, and middle finger on the card and showed it. Display card, Eternal Sphere. Eternal Sphere, myriad spectacles 9, 10 choose, 10 mana, treasure, fantasy wondrous item, tap, pay 5 choose. You choose the next card to enter the field and provide it with a perfect replica. The Eternal Sphere can only maintain a single illusion on the field. Starry sky reflection, mysterious and complicated. Brando paid 10 fiery p, but his mana was also depleted. The card floated in the air and turned into a mysterious light array. Then, a ball of mercury the size of a fist with 17 brass rings around it floated out of the array and stopped not far from Brando's left shoulder. Cabias was slightly taken aback when it saw this little toy, but the soulfire in its eye sockets immediately shrunk back. As an undead that was most sensitive to mana ripples and soul energy, it immediately sensed that something was amiss. This was a fantasy treasure, a gold-tier magic item. Cabias could not imagine how a silver-tier summoner and a peak iron-tier elementalist could summon a fantasy treasure. But it finally felt a sense of threat, and it could not let the opponent continue to prepare. For the first time, it felt that Brando's words were not empty. Even though it knew that it would be difficult to win against the opponent's strange elemental power, an inexplicable sense of urgency drove it to grip the short spear in its claws. Cabias let out a roar of unwillingness from its chest. It was already prepared to attack. As for that bastard Rothko, it could not be bothered with him anymore. But Brando also felt the same sense of urgency. He spent 5 fiery p to tap the Eternal Sphere. Then, he drew the second card. This was the card of fate that he had always prepared in his 4 hands. He raised the card, put it down, and said, "The light of mercy descends from heaven, and the emissary of God goes forth from the light." The young man's calm eyes reflected the approaching short spear in Cabias's hands, but Brando pointed forward. Along with the white light, white feathers fell from the sky. 4 pairs of wings protected Brando, one on the left and one on the right. Clang! Clang! Cabias was slightly taken aback. It raised its head, and for the first time, the soulfire in its eye sockets wavered. It was forcefully stopped. The tall skeleton general saw that the short spear in its hand was being blocked by 2 crisscrossed longswords on its left and right. The surface of the sword was bright as snow, and mysterious runes and patterns were engraved all over the blade. If a knowledgeable Buga sorcerer were here, he or she would have recognized these ancient runes as heavenly runes. This was a sacred language that came from behind the door of order, and only the proud light blessed could master it. Cabias raised its head. In its eyes, 2 angels made of light flapped their 4 pairs of wings and floated around the young man. They arrogantly raised their chins and looked at it with a look of disdain. The long swords in their hands were crisscrossed, blocking its path forward. Brando stood behind the crisscrossed long swords with a black tome in his hand. He raised his head and looked at the skeleton general with a calm gaze. "Upper silver tier," the skeleton general squeezed out the words one by one. Brando smiled at it. The flames in Cabias's eyes were about to burst out. It growled and took a step back. Upper silver tier was not enough to stop it. Even if it was caught off guard, in front of a middle gold tier, a silver tier existence was nothing but cannon fodder. It used its gigantic skeletal claws to push against the ground and used the momentum to leap forward. The short spear in its hand drew a dazzling red line in the air. Brando took a step back and ordered the 2 angels to block it. With a loud bang, the 2 angels were sent flying. But that was enough. When the pristine archangel entered the battlefield, Brando had already retrieved the wind spirit spider and Highland squire from the graveyard. When the pristine archangel enters the battlefield, choose a non-black card from your graveyard and shuffle it into your deck. Cabias broke through the defenses of the 2 angels in an instant, but it had already raised a grey-white Highland squire card and flicked it forward. Highland's Courage. In a flash of white light, the long-awaited young man rushed out of the magic circle with his hands on his head. "By the name of Martha, my lord." The Shire rolled forward and screamed with a familiar voice, "I can't believe you got me out so quickly." "My lord, you are the wisest knight of the Highland, my lord." "Ah!" He let out a strange cry and ducked his head. An angel had already flown over his head and crashed into a pile of rubble not far away with a loud boom. Charles immediately glanced over and was so shocked that he clicked his tongue. Brando only smiled. His finger moved to the 9th page, the 3rd line. Card of Fate, Trial. To unlock this card, you need to pay 80 wealth. Brando nodded and raised the card. Show me the trial. He put the card down. Trial. Wolf's Lair 2, Earth 10, Event Exploration. Target summoned creature receive 250,000 EXP. The Wolf's Lair altar is a kind of spiritual harbor for the Lornians. Attached to. A voice replied in his mind when the card appeared. Brendel used 4 fingers to show the card to Seal, who was covering his head and scurrying away. Attach. The trial card disappeared in an instant, but another card appeared in front of Brando. Highland Mage, Night 9, Water 5, Creature, Human Wizard, Level 45 Creature. When a Highland Mage enters the battlefield, 5 reputation per week. Maintenance cost, 2 Earth EP for every day this card remains in the battlefield. Highland's Courage. Brando was slightly stunned and looked up. He saw a white light descending from the sky. The Shire was standing in the middle of the light. His simple robe was bathed in the gentle white light, and 2 mysterious patterns appeared on it. There were also 3 circles of grayish-white patterns on the side of his robe. It was the symbol of a Highland Mage of the 7 Rings. The person in question was stunned. He looked at himself in confusion and opened his hand. A short golden staff appeared in his hand. This is. The Shire was shocked. He looked back and saw the 2nd Archangel flying towards him. The young man who had just become a mage immediately reached out his hand. It was as if a layer of transparent air cushion had appeared on his hand, and he gently held the Archangel. The Shire raised his head and looked at Brando, his eyes full of surprise. The strength of a gold mage. Brando understood. His expression did not change, and he immediately ordered, the Shire, Barrier of Stillness. The young mage naturally knew how to cooperate with his lord. He had already seen Cabias rushing towards them after breaking through the Archangel. The Shire shook his head, thinking that these skeletons were too rash. He pointed his short staff in the direction of the Archangel and said, Law of Time, Stillness, and Imprisonment. A transparent wall appeared out of thin air. The Highland Mage pushed forward, and Cabias immediately crashed into the wall. The undead lord felt its movement slow down. It raised its head in surprise, and only then did it discover that there was another gold mage in front of it. A Highland Mage of the 7 Rings. Cabias felt its soul fire on the verge of disintegrating. Oh, Martha! Is this guy's reinforcements unlimited? How many gold mages does he have? The undead lord's jaw cracked open, and the soul fire in its eye sockets dimmed. For the first time, it felt the shadow of defeat looming over it. Unlike warriors, mages were weak in self-defense, but their spells were terrifyingly powerful. This was especially true for Highland mages, whose spells were strange and unavoidable. Once a warrior of the same rank or even a higher rank was entangled in a mage's spell, it was basically a guaranteed defeat. Moreover, this was the work of a great mage of the 7 Rings. It knew that its only chance was to end the battle before the Shire could cast a spell, but Brando, who was standing in front of him, had cut off the undead lord's last shred of hope. Brando held a large tome in his hand, looking at the tall undead lord with pity, and then shook his head. Farewell, Cabias, he said softly. His expression deeply pierced Cabias's heart. It struggled unwillingly in the static barrier, roaring and roaring at a high frequency from its chest. However, in this transparent barrier, it could only feel heavy shackles binding its limbs. Its movements were as slow as a snail's. At the same time, Brando finally revealed his last summoning card. Wind Spirit Spiders. Brando was no longer the same as when he was in the auction house. With his abundant mana, he could summon an army of 50 spiders. When the densely packed sky-blue spiders landed on the street, everyone, including the Shire, was stunned. Everyone looked at the young lord, unable to understand why he would summon these little things that were not even at the level of steel. In the past, these spiders might have been able to win with their numbers, but in this place, they were useless. Unless they were used for reconnaissance, but even if they were used for reconnaissance, the archangels were much faster than them. In the eyes of the Nightsong Tiger, the Shire, and the Wild Elf sisters, Brando's actions were a waste of mana. However, their opinions could not change Brando's mind, and the young man continued to do as he pleased. He cut his hand, and the remaining 3 cards were Holy Sword, White Sun Blade, and Golden Battle Flag. Brando took out the card of Fate, Holy Sword. He raised the card, paid the fee, and attached the card to the Wind Spirit Spider card. At that moment, everyone saw the image of a winged holy sword floating behind each of the Wind Spirit Spiders, as if they were holy swords floating in the air. There were 50 of them. As expected, Brando smiled. He raised his hand, and the Wind Spirit Spiders immediately formed a huge square formation behind him. It looked like a square formation formed by shining holy swords in the sky. Brando looked at the Shire. This. The young wizard was tongue-tied for a moment. That's why I gave this move a name. Brando turned around and looked at Cabius, who was still trapped in the barrier, and said, "Let's call it the Dragon Rider system." He raised his hand and waved his 5 fingers. Dragon Riders, attack. Author's note, for chapters today, what time will it be tomorrow? If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 234. 50 golden flames were ignited in an instant. The dazzling beam of light swept across the spiritual armor around the undead lord's body like a stream of hot steel. A circle of ripples spread out, and the light spots splashed, cracked, or deviated like water splashes. However, the spiritual armor was also fading and collapsing. The temperature rose rapidly, deflecting the light rays. Cabius's face was distorted by the steam, and the spiritual armor finally crumbled. Madara! The undead lord's roar reverberated in the night sky, and the beams of light flashed 3 times in the darkness. "Oh, Martha, that idiot!" Roscoe stood in the alley, the soulfire in his eyes reflecting the beautiful golden lines under the night sky. He couldn't help but curse with his teeth clenched. Then, he leaned weakly against the wall and slowly slid to the ground. He shook his head. He used to think that he was a genius. When Haku raised his head, his golden eyes squinted slightly. He threw away the corpse in his hand as if he was throwing away a toy. He could feel his spiritual barrier, absolute seal, shaking. There shouldn't be anyone stronger than me on the battlefield. The Black Knight was doubtful, and a deep light flashed in his eyes. However, at that moment, everyone on the battlefield felt a throbbing in their souls. This throbbing feeling swept across the entire battlefield in an instant. Even the soul fire of the skeleton soldiers, who had no emotions, was shaken. Everyone, including the undead, turned their heads subconsciously. Their eyes, or the soul fire burning in their empty eye sockets, were staring blankly in a certain direction. The battle stopped. Scarlet, who was covered in blood, got up from the ground. She used her fist to wipe away the blood dripping down from her chin. Her amber eyes still had a hint of stubbornness, but she could still feel the throbbing feeling clearly. It was as if she heard a crisp shattering sound in her heart. Crack! Something broke. She raised her head and saw that the spiritual barrier above her was crumbling, scattering, and falling to the ground. The huge fragments were like black shadows that melted into the air, emitting a piercing sound. The undead knight let out a low groan on the other side. Haku pressed his chest in shock. Someone had forcefully broken his enchantment barrier. This was impossible. The undead general, one of the 4 knights of the apocalypse, felt as if his soul fire had turned cold. There was no one on the battlefield who could surpass him in terms of power. However, a halo of light immediately reflected in his golden eyes. It was a cluster of light that appeared from the darkness and swept across the sky. Everyone was stunned. Their eyes followed the movement of the light. When the light passed over everyone's head, everyone subconsciously turned their heads in that instant. Thus, they saw that in an instant, the light spots in the air became incomparably dazzling. And holy aura was gathering. Dragon Knights, attack! The first beam of light appeared. It pierced through the darkness and descended from the sky. The mercenary closest to the beam of light turned his head and saw the beam of light piercing through the skull, chest, and pelvis of the 3 skeletons. At that moment, it was as if time had stopped. The young mercenary was at a loss. He opened his mouth slightly, but with a crash, the 3 skeletons had already fallen to the ground. Then came the second, and the third. The light in the sky flickered one after another. The light became denser and denser as if it was raining. The rain of gods fell from the sky, and in the span of a breath, the skeletal spear-throwers of the Bone Thorn army were reduced to ashes. After 2 rounds of attacks, only a few skeletal spear-throwers were left standing outside the defensive line. The mercenaries were stunned for a moment before they cheered. Martha above! Kill these filthy creatures! Cornelius stared blankly at the scene before him. He placed a hand in front of Sifrit to protect the little girl, and his heart was filled with joy. But even so, he could not help but wipe the cold sweat off his forehead. He looked at his second-in-command who was also pale. The 2 of them had recognized the voice from the start. It was the voice of the young man. But they did not expect him to have such an ability. Cornelius finally understood what he had to do. He drew his sword and swung it forward. Brothers, attack! Don't waste this opportunity. With a roar, the tide of the battle changed. It was only at this moment that Ahab recovered from his shock. The undead knight's gaze landed outside the battlefield. But this time, he only saw 2 holy angels splitting the fog apart and charging at him from the left and right. The angels flapped their wings with astonishing speed, and the holy swords were already right in front of his eyes. The undead knight did not move at all. He raised his scythe in his right hand and swept the 2 holy angels away, leaving behind white feathers that fluttered in the wind. But Ahab did not relax in the slightest. A large amount of mana was gathering in the air. He looked up and saw several edges of light appearing above his head. The edges of light formed a huge cube that was dozens of meters wide, and it quickly solidified into a large boulder that came crashing down on him. The ground trembled, and the boulder fell to the ground with a loud bang. Smoke and dust filled the battlefield. Substance transformation, law manifestation. A high circle law wizard. The undead knight crawled up from the ground, his face covered in dust, and stared at the fog behind him. When the fog parted, the battlefield was filled with cries of war. The mercenaries' attacks were like quicksilver, and without the support of the undead, Grodin's private army collapsed under the suppression of the dragoons. The undead general held his black scythe and coldly watched the cowardly humans escape from him one by one. It was as if a torrent of water was crashing down on the battlefield in his direction. At that moment, the battlefield was about to collapse. Loud, painful groans echoed in the air. But he still had one last chance. Ahab looked through the crowd and finally saw Brando standing on the other side of the battlefield. He had to get rid of the flying balls of light, but he did not have that much time. Ahab had reason to believe that someone was controlling these strange things and dominating the battlefield. But as long as he killed that young man, all his problems would be solved, and the scales of the battlefield would tilt in his favor. He snorted coldly and laid down the scythe in his hand. Brando also saw the Black Knight, one of the 4 knights of the apocalypse. This old opponent of his looked exactly the same as the Ahab he met in the past. He was still wearing the same pretentious outfit. But the Black Knight should not have obtained the evil dragon's blood yet, so it would be easier to deal with him. He smiled. To catch the bandits, first kill the ringleader. This was indeed a choice that the Black Knight, who had always been confident in his abilities and speed, would make. But Ahab did not expect his intentions to be seen through. He only saw the Shire standing behind the young noble with a short staff, followed by the Nightsong Tiger, the Wild Elf sisters, and the rest of the mercenaries of Lopez. After the 2 angels flew back, they landed on either side of Brendel as if they were his personal guards. But the Black Knight had never heard of anyone using the heavenly realm as guards. The strength of this group was quite strong, but he did not think that there was no chance. Then Ahab moved. His figure flashed, and the Black Knight flashed 3 times on the battlefield like a shadow. Each time he flashed, he crossed a distance of nearly 100 meters. But Brendel was not in a hurry. With a thought, the dragon cavalry in the skies suddenly changed their formation. They immediately turned their spearheads and aimed at a certain area, firing in unison. The chaotic golden light pillars hit the ground one after another, and it was as if a golden forest had suddenly appeared on the street. The dragon knights did not even need to aim. Their numbers were more than enough to make up for their lack of accuracy. Under the coverage of the light arrows, even a gold-ranked Black Knight would not dare to expose himself to 10 or even more silver-ranked attacks per second at any given moment. Left with no choice, he could only raise his scythe to counterattack. A black arc of light dispersed the rain of light and wiped out 7 or 8 wind spirit spiders in an instant. The Holy Sword card could provide silver-ranked attack power to the attached card, but it would not affect the other aspects of the card. In the face of a gold-ranked attack, the wind spirit spiders, which were not even at the level of steel, were as weak as paper. But when Ahab wanted to pursue further, he realized that the light dots in the sky had already scattered and were firing at him from afar. When he started moving again, they gathered together and suppressed him with powerful firepower. Apart from the advantage of the first attack, the Black Knight realized that he did not have any advantage at all. Instead, his speed inevitably decreased. Ahab raised his head. For the first time, he felt that his every move was under the enemy's control. On the other hand, the Nightsong Tiger and the others were dumbfounded by the Dragon Knight's nimble fighting style. The Shire explained to them with a profound expression. That's why I said that there are 3 indicators that will always exist in a game: skill, equipment, and stats. You can see that this is the embodiment of Sir Lord's superior skills and equipment. Of course, Sir Lord once told me, Charles, when you look at these 3 indicators, there will always be one that can help you. If one day you grow into an archmage, then you must thank me for telling you this secret. He nodded and said something that did not match his heart. Now that I've become a great wizard, you can see that I'm very grateful to my lord for telling me this secret. The Wild Elf sister could not help but giggle when she heard that. The Shire, Brando gritted his teeth. You better join the battle as soon as possible. Of course, my lord, I'm preparing a spell, the Shire immediately replied. But my lord, I saw a lot of nobles' private soldiers. Wait, what does that emblem have to do with Count Ranner? That's Count Ranner's men. Another count. Does that mean my lord has offended a noble again? The young wizard was shocked. By the name of Martha, my lord, I bet you must have been a person with a deep grudge in your past life. It doesn't matter. According to what you said, the 2 of us were hanged the last time. Brendel continued to give orders to the dragon cavalry system while he replied in annoyance, and this time, they'll just drag us out and hang us again. That's true. The Shire raised an eyebrow. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 235. The Shire's spell was finally completed. A wall of light formed by countless lines appeared in front of Brando. The Black Knight, who had just arrived, slashed the wall with his scythe, leaving a trail of sparks behind. His golden pupils contracted slightly, and he immediately retreated. In fact, when he saw the wall, he already knew that his mission was a failure. He could no longer kill the young man in a short time. Putting aside the fact that the wall of law created by a 7th Circle mentor was extremely sturdy, Brando himself was also a gold tier rank 1. At first, he thought that he could rely on his speed to win, but he did not expect that the other party seemed to have known what he would do from the start. The young human decisively gave up on supporting the entire battlefield and withdrew all the dragoons just to restrict his movements. Despite having so many bodyguards around him, he still chose to give up on the overall situation and focus on his own safety. Such a person was either too afraid of death, or he had a terrible sense of judgment. But no matter which one it was, at least he had won the gamble. Haku raised his head, the flames in his golden eyes burning. He calmly looked into Brando's light brown eyes not far away. He even had a feeling that his opponent was an old rival he had fought for many years. Of course, Haku did not know that Brando was the old rival he had fought for many years. The two of them had fought more than 10 times in the mountains of the Church's Knight's Nation, Grace. They knew each other very well. Moreover, at that time, Haku had already obtained the evil dragon's blood. Whether it was maturity or strength, the Black Knight could not compare to him now. However, Brando's understanding of Haku and his own experience had not changed at all. But all of this was strange in the eyes of the Black Knight. He retreated, and Brando immediately ordered, "Stop him." Haku Tiamas Choyu, one of the 4 Knights of the Apocalypse, the Black Knight of the Scales of War and the Judge of War, was an undead general of Madara. Although his individual strength was always at the bottom of the 4 knights, he was the most talented commander among the 4. Brando knew that he was the one who led the strategy to defeat Braggs in the Second War of the Black Rose, and it was not his style to let him return to Madara and become a thorn in the side of Erwin in the future. Besides, to him, killing Haku here was equivalent to cutting off one of Tarkus's arms. Furthermore, the undead army of Madara would not give him so much pressure in the south. Furthermore, he still had to face the wrath of Count Randner. Haku heard Brando's words, and he could not help but sneer. "You want to kill him? It's not that easy." Even though he could not do anything to Brando at the moment, that was because he still had to maintain the noble's private army. If he did not have any worries and wanted to teach this young human a lesson, he believed that the outcome would be different. Even though Brando's words angered him, Haku still chose to retreat. As a general who excelled in intelligence, knowing what to do at the right time was an essential quality. He turned around and shook off the Shire's barrier of stillness, and flashed past the 2 holy angels like a ghost, and finally brushed past Scarlet, who had chased after him from the battlefield. The whole process happened in the blink of an eye, and the red-haired girl only had time to turn around to see the Black Knight's back was already dozens of meters away. "Bastard," she gritted her teeth and looked in the direction of the Black Knight. Brando shook his head. In fact, he was also disappointed. He did not expect that he would fail. He wanted to use words to provoke this guy to stay, but he did not expect this guy to be as calm as he was after the first War of the Black Roses. He thought that Haku had always been arrogant, and he was not as mature as he was later, so he might be a little impulsive. How troublesome, this freak, Brando could not help but curse. Torrential Rain's design team, do you even know how to make an NPC? Can't you think from a player's point of view and make it simpler? Bastard. But he immediately thought of another problem and turned to the Shire. "The Shire, go find Cornelius. He might need your help, and I'm worried that Haku will take Groudon away." "Cornelius? A mercenary commander. He's one of us now. What should I do, my lord? Are you a mage or am I a mage?" Act according to the circumstances, Brando replied. If that silly girl Freya can become the goddess of war, I believe you can do the same. Ha! It's nothing, Brando replied with a straight face. I'm just helping her plan her life. Understood, the Shire bowed. It's an honor. Go. Brando nodded. The Shire could not help but sigh when he saw the red-haired girl limping towards him. She really looks like Miss Freya, my lord. So this is your type, but before he could finish his sentence, Scarlet rolled her eyes. Scarlet gritted her teeth and glanced at the Shire before walking past him to Brando's side. Scarlet? Brando asked. Yes. Scarlet was slightly surprised. Brando looked at her. I'm fine. Scarlet wiped the blood off her face and replied casually, but my lord, Medisha, I know. Brando nodded. But it doesn't matter. I still have enough light elemental energy to save Medisha. Scarlet glanced at the young lord. She vaguely knew the relationship between the Silver Fairy Princess and this young lord. Even though it was a little strange, she nodded and did not ask any more questions. She just needed to make sure that Medisha was fine. Even though Brando did not reply, she got the answer she wanted from his face. She knew that Brando was not the kind of person who would be indifferent to his subordinates' deployment. The situation on the battlefield was changing. In fact, the mercenaries had already crossed the last line of defense of the nobles' private army. After Haku retreated, he immediately ordered the nobles to retreat into the inner city. But he did not expect that his order would cause the situation on the battlefield to become even more difficult to deal with. The Black Knight was used to commanding an undead army in battle. Even though he understood the habits of humans, he was not as good as the human generals when it came to understanding human nature. Without the support of the undead, Grodin's private army had no place to stand. Their morale was already shaken, and the nobles' private army completely lost their confidence when they heard the order to retreat. They scattered along the 5 streets like ducks being chased out of 1,000 miles. Brendel ordered the Nightsong Tiger to tell Cornelius not to kill them all before they entered the inner city. Otherwise, these arrogant and domineering nobles' private soldiers would probably be crying for their parents by now. Mr. Tyamas could only stare at the scene with his mouth agape. When the Black Knight got on his horse and saw the army scattering, he couldn't help but curse, fools. But cursing was meaningless. Haku understood that. He looked up and saw the light spots that seemed to be cruising in the night sky. Occasionally, they would shoot 1 or 2 beams to the ground, taking away the nobles' private soldiers who were still stubbornly resisting, or the undead squads that had been scattered. The undead general's eyes flashed with interest. The young human had given him a bigger surprise than he had imagined. A summoner. Summoners didn't have such strange summoning spells, but he couldn't rule out the possibility that it was ancient magic. In the era before the Dark Dragon, the system of magic was very different from the one now. Just like the ancient string magic used by the dragons, it was a completely different concept from modern string magic. Haku's golden eyes narrowed slightly. If only Lord Tarkus' main force is here. Ghosts and high-rank liches would be able to suppress these aerial units. But he knew that it was just wishful thinking. Lord Inserste had a more important mission in the south, and his main force was used to deal with Erwin's Southern Legion. It was impossible for him to appear here. He knew that the White Tower's Bone Thorn army was already the limit, but he shook his head when he saw that the young human had caused him to lose close to 10% of his army's strength. Fortunately, it was just a skeleton javelin thrower. But even if he won, it wouldn't be that easy. There were still a few dozen guards in the inner city, most of them were knights that Grodin had usurped. He could rely on them to hold on for a while, but in this situation, taking the Baron away was the safest option. It was hard to say if they could hold on until the main force arrived. He didn't want to take the risk. The Black Knight thought about this and silently looked towards the west. Young human, our battle is still ongoing. The Black Knight's nightmare warhorse passed by the scattered soldiers and entered the inner city at the fastest speed possible. He dragged his long cloak across the drawbridge like a bolt of black lightning, ordering the knight in the porch to raise the drawbridge and close the gate. He decisively gave up on the idea of reorganizing the burdens behind him. Not to mention whether the young human would give him the time to do so, Haku didn't plan to let them charge into the inner city to prevent him from taking advantage of the situation. As for whether the humans outside were dead or alive, it had nothing to do with him. When the undead general of Madara changed into a new set of armor and arrived at the top of the walls, he found that Brando and his mercenaries had already reached the inner city. They were faster than he expected. The scattered soldiers were fleeing along the walls of Abe's castle, unable to stop them at all. He turned around and saw Groudon standing beside him, wearing a long silk robe. His face was pale. "Lord Tiamat." The Baron couldn't help but ask. "We can't stop them here," the Black Knight looked down and replied coldly, "If you want to stay alive, you have to come with me." The Baron was stunned. "What about my men?" he asked in a small voice. "Can you control them?" The golden eyes under the metal mask coldly glanced at him. Groudon was speechless. Just as he was about to say something, he suddenly heard a cry of surprise. Both of them turned their heads at the same time, just in time to see a young man wearing a long robe with 3 golden patterns embroidered on his sleeves walk out from the mercenaries. He held a short staff in his hand and pointed forward. 6 golden rays immediately extended from the main street to the top of the inner city wall. Groudon was stunned. "It's that archmage, stop him!" Haku growled. But it was too late. The knight lowered his hand and said, "Substance conversion, law, equivalent exchange." "Azu." The gem at the tip of the staff lit up. "Ancient language, exchange." "Mana." The 6 golden lines glowed faintly and extended downwards. Behind the lines, 3 gigantic bridges made of stone appeared out of thin air. There was complete silence. "Allow me to rest for today. My gallbladder is about to burst from exhaustion. I have to cut it off as soon as possible. If you want to know what will happen after this, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 236. 6 dark and cold stone bridges rose from the Shire's staff and crashed into the inner city walls. The ground shook violently as Groudon's knights climbed up from behind the walls. They were terrified to find that there was no longer any obstacle between them and their enemies. The battlefield was silent for a moment. It was as if a silent angel had flown over everyone's head, rendering them speechless. However, the young magus withdrew his staff and stepped back. He then raised his head and smiled at the pale-faced knights on the city wall. At that moment, the dull sound of hooves could be heard from behind him. The mercenaries' cavalrymen rushed out from the Shire's back and overtook the young wizard in an instant. They rushed up the stone bridges. The cavalry moved forward, and the young lord's sword also moved forward. Brendel's sword reflected the cold light of the stars and remained motionless, as if it was responding to the same command, attack. Destroy the enemy. The ground rumbled, and the noble knight's expressions changed. A large number of mercenaries rushed up the walls, but Brando's summoned creatures were faster than them. The young man discarded his cards and summoned the 2 pristine archangels that were heavily injured in the battle with Cabias and Haku. He took out Medusa's card from the graveyard and ordered the pristine archangels to attack. The archangels of light flapped their wings and flew over everyone's heads. In an instant, they reached the top of the city wall, and with a flash of their swords, heads fell to the ground. Although the strength of an upper silver tier was nothing in front of Cabias and Haku, it was like an insurmountable mountain to these noble knights. With Cabias as the center, the knights retreated one after another. Their only choice seemed to be to flee in panic, and a large number of them had no choice but to turn around and push each other down the tower. Soon, a gap was created in the wall. Baileng coldly snorted when he saw this. He did not say a word and dragged Grodin into the castle. To him, the lives of these humans did not matter to him. He only wanted to make sure that Grodin was in good condition. Brando, who had been paying attention to the battle, saw the same scene. He smiled. Haku still doesn't understand the nature of humans. The young wizard lowered his head and whispered something to Scarlet. The young girl was slightly startled. She looked at him for a moment, then walked away doubtfully. Not long after she left, the battlefield was immediately filled with shouts. Lord Grodin has escaped. Lord Grodin has escaped. The few noble soldiers who were still resisting on the walls were startled when they heard the shouts. They could not help but turn around to look for Grodin, but the result was obvious. The front line was finally shaken. It was like the last straw that broke the camel's back. When Grodin's knights realized that they had lost their lord, they completely gave up after putting up some resistance. The situation gradually became clear. The mercenaries rushed into the castle like a flood and lowered the drawbridge. Brando then led his men into the castle. For him, there was still one last battle. The interior of the castle was dark and obscure. The corridors seemed to be endless as they spiraled downwards. Perhaps Grodin thought that he was the only one who knew the location of the secret passage to AB's castle. Unfortunately, this was nothing to Brando. This was the innate advantage of his other soul. When the Baron and Madara's undead general entered the hall, the young wizard followed behind them. Both sides entered the hall at the same time. Both sides stopped when they saw each other. Brando, Scarlet, and the Shire were on one side, while Grodin and Haku were on the other. The Baron did not expect this to happen. At that moment, he was stunned and almost thought that he had been betrayed by someone. For a moment, both sides were separated by a long table and did not move. The hall was still the same hall. It was as if the scene from the day before had reappeared. Even the atmosphere was astonishingly similar. Under the eerie silence, the air in the hall seemed to have stopped moving. Brando raised his head and looked at the beautiful red crystal chandelier on the ceiling. He could not help but think that history was indeed similar. He had chosen to compromise here the day before, but now he wanted to take back what he had lost. He lowered his head and looked at Grodin and the undead knight in front of him. Haku was also looking at them quietly, seemingly unsurprised. The undead knight raised his right hand and blocked Grodin with his huge scythe. Human, you are much more outstanding than I expected. I am surprised that Erwin has such a lowly noble like you. His voice was hollow like a layer of rusty metal that was losing its paint. Brando shook his head. All right, let's not waste time, Tiamas, he interrupted. You know whose life I'm here to take. I know I can't keep you here, but don't even think that you can take this Baron of Erwin away. He deliberately emphasized the last few words. A muffled sneer came from under the metal mask. I don't know who you are, but I'll assume that you're the Viscount. But Viscount, I remember that the rules between nobles in the human world are not like this. The one behind me is the local lord, a noble baron. His family's bloodline can be traced back to the last dynasty in your world. But today, Lord Viscount, you're telling me that you're going to make a move on one of the members of this glorious family and set a precedent for a bloody massacre between nobles. Of course I can put down my hand, Haku shrugged, but if I do you dare to kill him? Grodin stood behind the undead general with a gloomy expression. The honor of the kingdom will not fall on the head of a traitor. But a life and death struggle is not the rule of your game. Brando smiled. If a mere Count Randner is enough to make me fight to the death, then why am I here? Haku was slightly taken aback. What a bold statement. I don't know where your confidence comes from, Viscount Gastine. Grodin finally had the chance to interject, gritting his teeth as he spoke, a mere Count Ranner. I don't know where your confidence comes from. Did I ask you to speak? Brando glared at him. The young man's cold gaze was like a knife that pierced into Grodin's heart. Grodin's pupils shrank, and he immediately shut his mouth. The undead general of Madara clapped his hands. What courage! Grodin's metallic voice came from under the mask. But the Lornian said that a wise man should learn to find a balance between thinking and doing. Lord Viscount, I believe that Baron Grodin has learned his lesson, especially as a noble of the nobility. Why don't we stop here? There's still room for both of us to turn back. The Church's Night Kingdom is located between Grace and Saint-Aussol. They are also the main ethnic group in Grace. The Lornians also said that an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The Shire added with a smile behind Brando. But the blood that is shed is not your blood, my lord. Indeed, but nobles are not born with dignity. Brando coldly replied. Haku remained silent. But the young man also frowned because in his impression, this Black Knight of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse was never a person who talked nonsense. On the contrary, he and the White Knight, Ebden, were known to be taciturn and decisive in their actions. They preferred action over boasting. But now, Haku's behavior was the exact opposite of what he knew. He did not think that it was because Haku's current personality had changed drastically since then. There was only one reason left. Was Grodin that important? He did not know what kind of agreement Madara had with the Ranner family. What made him even more suspicious was Haku's intention to stall for time. However, the best way to break an unknown trap was to prevent them from getting what they wanted. Brando did not say a word. He stretched out his right hand and placed it on the hilt of his sword. With a light push, he took a step forward. As soon as he moved, a cold aura spread across half of the hole. Haku did not move, but Grodin, who was behind him, took 3 steps back and almost fell to the ground. The Baron finally managed to stand up with a red face. He gritted his teeth as he looked at Brendel, but his heart was filled with disbelief. Even though he was just an iron-ranked swordsman, he could still feel the true strength that Brendel had displayed. He had grown stronger again. Grodin could not believe that a person could become so strong in a day and a night. Of course, he did not think that it was an illusion brought about by the fact that he was an elementalist. The only possibility he could think of was that Brendel was hiding his strength. He immediately whispered this to Haku. The Black Knight nodded and looked at Brando with a playful expression. It was impossible for Cabius's report to be wrong. However, Grodin would not lie to him. Moreover, he had experienced it himself. Who should I believe? However, the undead general of Madara remained calm and asked, Viscount, are you not going to think twice before acting? Tiamas, interfering in the affairs of humans is not beneficial to you. Brando shook his head. You know that you can't leave with Grodin. If that's the case, why do you want to fight a meaningless battle with me? Step aside, I know this is not your habit. Haku shook his head. He looked at Brando approaching and used his scythe to keep a distance from the Baron. This battle is not necessary for Viscount Grodin, but it's different for me. Even though Madara does not have the tradition of forming an alliance with the living, there's a first time for everything. If we abandon our allies the first time, it won't be good for our reputation. He smiled under his mask. Moreover, you're right about one thing. It will be difficult for me to protect the Baron when he's surrounded by powerful enemies, Mr. Iamus. Grodin was startled, his face turning pale as he hurriedly asked. P.S. Thank you for your support. Even though the highest order of subscriptions didn't change much, the average order of subscriptions increased a lot. Thank you. Chapter 237. Mr. Tiamas. Groudon was startled by Haku's words, and his face turned pale. The only person he could rely on right now was the undead general of Madara. If Haku couldn't protect him, the young Viscount would definitely kill him. But Haku ignored him and continued, "But I'm confident that I can hold on for half an hour." Half an hour. Brando caught the gist of Haku's words like an old rival. What's the point of half an hour? Or do you have a purpose for stalling me for half an hour? If you weren't an enemy, I would have suspected that you were one of my best friends when I was alive. Haku sighed. Why do you always act like you know me so well, even if it's Marissa? No one knows me so well. Brando only smiled. He knew that Marissa was Haku's personal maid, and he knew that Haku was insulting him by saying that. But he was not willing to show any signs of weakness even if he lost. This was in line with his understanding of this person. Even if he lost, he would not admit defeat. Even in Madara, he had offended many people, or else he would not have been sent to Insursta's army, which was a ragtag army. But he didn't hold back at all. He continued forward until he was less than 10 meters away from Haku. At the same time, the Shire also prepared a spell behind him. "Mr. Viscount," Haku said, "have you ever wondered why the West Gate didn't give you a signal?" Brando was startled. He thought of something and his face darkened. "Ah, I remember that it's a beautiful red-haired mercenary, right?" The undead knight replied, "Of course, you don't have to worry, my lord. I don't have enough men to cause any trouble for them. But there's one thing I have to tell you. The men I sent to stop them should be more than enough to buy them some time." Brando didn't say a word. However, Bai continued, "I think at this time, Shimin and my kind should have already broken into the city. Of course, they are all filthy, low-level skeletons that lack command. You know that I don't really trust those low-level liches. But Mr. Viscount, no matter what, if you don't go back and remedy the situation immediately, not to mention the life of that beautiful lady, I'm afraid the entire battle situation will become very troublesome, right?" The young man had finally finished listening to his nonsense. He took a deep breath and tried his best to restrain himself from punching him in the face. Right now, he only wanted this crow's mouth to be unable to speak anymore. However, although he was angry, his heart was very clear that the other party had no reason to lie. As a matter of fact, he had been worried about the battle at the West Gate. Just like what Bai said, he had not received the magic beacon from the female mercenary group leader named Yuta. However, if the situation was really as serious as the latter said, the situation would not be as simple as just troublesome. It would be extremely dangerous. Not to mention the losses these undead caused to ABs, they also sealed off their escape route. The walls of the inner city were low and could not withstand the impact of the skeleton army. And if they let the enemy take advantage of the situation and attack the inner city, Brando could not help but feel his heart sink. He did not think that Brendel would dare to divide his forces at this time. He could not help but wonder if Brendel really cared about Groudon's life. Even if he said that he did not care, his actions did not seem like it. But if he said that he cared, this plan was more like a madman's. Unless he wanted to take Groudon away from the start. But was there a need for that? Groudon was only one of Count Randner's sons, and he was not even the eldest son. Brando could not help but take a deep breath. Tiamat's attack had hit his vitals. He raised his head and looked at the Black Knight with a gloomy expression. He finally understood the knight's intention to stall for time. Fortunately, he was alert enough and did not let the knight's scheme succeed. At least he still had a choice. Damn it, as expected of the scales of war, Brando cursed in his heart. This was the first war of the Black Rose. But this guy had already displayed wisdom and foresight that was not inferior to the future. Brendel even had a feeling that this guy might have already guessed what he was planning to do. Brando tightened his grip on his sword hilt. If he could, he really wanted to kill Brendel. Compared to killing Groudon, Brendel was more willing to kill Groudon first, but he knew it was unrealistic. Brendel smiled at him. There's still half an hour left. Let's make a deal. Grodin, who was behind him, also let out a sigh of relief. The Baron squeezed out an ugly smile from his stiff face. He looked at Brando, who seemed to be stuck in a dilemma, and his heart was filled with a sense of schadenfreude. It was as if the city of Abes, which was about to be destroyed, was not even part of his territory and had nothing to do with him. But that's true. I can just rebuild the city if it's destroyed. As for the people, they're all over the place, and I don't care about them. He was more concerned about Brando's feelings. He couldn't help but smile. Young man, there's a price to pay for being impulsive. But he suddenly remembered the price he had to pay for provoking Brendel, and his tone softened. But I admit that you're strong. Strength is always worthy of respect. Of course, if you're willing to put this matter to rest, I can also make a promise on behalf of my father. I promise that the conflict between us will end here. He seemed to relax as he spoke with assurance. You should know that nobles aren't willing to go to war where both sides suffer. But there's one more thing. My adopted daughter is still in your hands. He was about to continue the topic when he saw Brendel turn around and stare coldly at him from under the metal mask. Grodin felt a chill in his heart. He suddenly realized something and quickly shut his mouth. At the same time, Brendel turned around and waited for Brando's reply. The Shire and Scarlet also looked at their lord. Brando replied coldly, compromising again and again, Tiamas. Do you think I'm a complete idiot? Or are you willing to give up? I know these skeletons can't stop you, my lord, but what about your subordinates? The undead knight asked. Of course, I can accept it. This is the difference between you and me. Grodin smiled gloomily. He knew that Brendel was trying to force Brando to give him a hard time. But he liked the idea, especially the day before when he used the same method to force Brando to compromise. Seeing his opponent walk into the same trap twice filled him with a gloomy sense of mischief. Brando sighed. Tiamas, there's an old saying in my hometown. He loosened his grip on the hilt of his sword. A man can't step into the same river twice in his life. Brendel nodded. Brando's right hand flashed, and the long sword in his hand drew a straight line towards Grodin. The undead knight reacted in a split second. He raised the giant scythe in his hand slightly, and with a clang, the long sword flew past the Baron's right arm with a flash of silver light. With a thud, it nailed itself into an oil painting not far behind. But even though it was fixed, the sword's hilt was still trembling. Brendel looked behind him. Grodin was already clutching the wound on his right arm. His face was pale, and he looked at Brando with hatred in his eyes. This was the second time. He didn't know what kind of deep hatred this young man had for him to teach him a lesson every time. Brendel turned around and sighed. Why do you have to do this, Mr. Brando? Hatred is not unresolvable. But what I'm more interested in is what you meant by that sentence you said earlier. That sentence can be interpreted in many ways, Brando replied calmly, but I like one of them the most. It's that a man can't make the same mistake over and over again in his life. It's a test of a man's intelligence. So, Brendel looked at him. You want to fight me? That's right. The undead knight's grip tightened, and his metal gauntlets tightened around his scythe. He stared at Brendel and said, then give it a try. I'm looking forward to seeing if you can get around me in a shorter amount of time. The spiritual armor formed by the soul fire expanded in an instant, forming a silver wall that was close to solidifying. Brando looked at him and shook his head. Tiamas, what did you get wrong? What do you mean? Brendel asked. In fact, I've already avoided you. Brendel said calmly. His gaze swept past the knight's shoulder and landed on the long sword that was stuck in the painting. The sword was still trembling, and its tip was pinned to a card that no one else could see. It was a card depicting a unicorn knight. The elven flag flutters high, the heart shines, the sword shines. Come out, Medisha. A mournful scream rang out. Brendel turned around and saw a silver knight's spear piercing through Grodin's chest. The Baron's face was still filled with disbelief. He used all his strength to turn around, but the spear only retracted slightly, and a stream of blood shot out. Grodin fell to the ground like a pile of rotten meat. The undead knight turned around and glared at Brendel. Medisha, how is this possible? Didn't I already injure her? He growled. Brando looked at him with a condescending and mocking gaze. Do you still remember that I'm a summoner? The Shire couldn't help but shiver when he heard Brendel's words. What kind of summoner is this? Brendel frowned. That's impossible. Summoners can't bypass my soulfire wall and summon at a fixed point. Brando smiled. That's why I'm the special one. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 238. The slender sword pierced through the skull, and the last undead terracotta also lost its strength and fell to the ground. The female mercenary with long red hair held her sword with one hand and panted heavily as she looked around. Her emerald eyes reflected the corpses and skeletons on the ground. The battle was over. Although they paid a heavy price, they managed to repel the attackers. Janna heaved a sigh of relief and sheathed her rapier in a black leather sheath. Leader! A shout came from behind. She turned around and saw a young man running out of the crowd. The female mercenary saw the young man running in front of her, but she stopped him and said, "No need to say anything, leave some people behind to take care of our injured brothers. The rest of you, come with me. We've wasted enough time, we need to take control of the west gate before the undead army arrives." "Wait!" The young man called out to him breathlessly. "What's wrong?" Yuta frowned. "It's too late," the young man said loudly. "When we were fighting with the monsters, Rat, and the others saw the magic beacon from the south. Leader, it's too late, the undead have already arrived. If we go there now, we'll only face the undead army." The female mercenary leader stopped and looked at him. "What else did Rat say?" "Rat said that our only choice is to give up. We'll break through the encirclement to the north and leave Abes. If the undead come, we'll all die here. If we leave, what about the others? Leader, can we change anything by staying here?" The young man said anxiously. "Bastard!" The female mercenary leader punched the wall. "Tell our people to prepare. Tell the owls, gray wolves, and brown bears to lead people along the 3 streets. Since we can't stop them from entering Abes, we'll stop them from entering the city." "Leader, you're crazy." The man shouted. "We have less than 300 people, and there are thousands of them. We can't stop them without the city walls." The female mercenary leader pressed her chest and gritted her teeth. "We have to stop them even if we can't. Do you want me to break my promise?" "Leader." The young man was startled. "What are you waiting for? But is it worth it for a noble?" The youth took a deep breath. "That young man is also a noble. He only helped us because of the conflict between him and Grodin. In the end, they were still the same kind of people. Why should we fight for people like them?" The man gritted his teeth and shouted at her. "Leader, your sister and parents died in the hands of those damned nobles. Most of the brothers under your command also had the same experience. Everyone respected you, so we came together. Why should we die here for that kind of person? Let them fight amongst themselves." Yuta was stunned. She sighed and raised her head to say something. However, at this moment, a loud bang came from the direction of Abes Castle. Everyone turned around and saw a beam of white light rising into the sky from the darkness. It was a magic beacon. A pure white beam of light pierced through the night sky, as if it had pierced through the darkness of the world. The light seemed so pure and flawless against the deep background, as if it was the first hair of Mother Marcia in the darkness in the epic of the creation of the Kurlutz people. It was the first light that depicted the birth of the world. Light was born from the darkness, giving all things wisdom, nobility, and spirituality. At that moment, Yuta and her assistant raised their heads in a daze, their eyes reflecting the light in the darkness. They watched as the light rose to the highest point and exploded. Then, it turned into a message that was commonly used in the army. The words shone in the night sky and did not fade away for a long time. The red-haired female mercenary captain raised her head, and a deep glint flashed in her dark green eyes. "Grodin is dead, my lord wants us to reply immediately," she said calmly. "My lord." The youth looked at her in shock. Yuta lowered her head and smiled at the youth. "If Cornelius dared to choose this path, why wouldn't I? Grodin is dead, and that young noble gave me an answer. From now on, he will be my follower." She smiled and shook her head. "Unfortunately, the time is too short." "But, no buts. Can we reply?" Yuta asked. The youth shook his head. "Those liches use dark magic to silence the entire street. Other than the light and dark elements, no other elements can enter. But we don't have any wizards or priests in our group. Our strongest elementalist is only an iron-ranked warrior, and we can't cast any spells." "What about the signal arrow?" Rat said that the arrow is ignited by elements. Yuta gritted her teeth and looked at the other side of the street. "Then we'll use our own method to buy some time for our lord." "Leader." But the woman's face had already turned serious. She was silent for a moment, raised her head, turned around, pulled out her thin sword and waved it to the right. "Everyone has one. Listen up. Someone gave us an answer with noble actions, but now we've lost our promise. Fortunately, we can still salvage the situation. So I order you to move forward and drag those damned skeletons here. Or let them step over our corpses." The street was silent for a moment, and only Yuta's solemn order echoed for a long time. Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked at the regiment commander subconsciously. "Answer me, there are no cowards among my men. There are no cowards." The mercenaries raised their weapons. The young man stared blankly at Jana. He wanted to say something but was interrupted by the female mercenary commander. "You don't have to say anything. You know that I won't change my mind easily once I give an order." "But leader, why do you have to do this for a noble?" Yuta smiled gently. She lowered her head and patted the youth's face. "I know nobles better than you, little one. If that young man was a noble, he wouldn't have killed Grodin. This is the rule between them, and no one has ever broken it in the past few hundred years." She raised her head and looked at the dark night. "But no matter who he is, at least from this moment onwards, our deal is done." The youth was stunned for a moment. At the south gate, the fierce battle was still ongoing. Under the supervision of the Firebrand Legion's Grand Commander, the mercenaries maintained the same rhythm time and time again, engaging in a tug-of-war with the skeletal army without any regard for their own losses. The battle in the darkness seemed to be endless. Everyone could not help but feel exhausted. As far as the eye could see, all they could see were piles of white bones. The humans and the undead exchanged losses, and the corpses piled up like mountains. However, the most they could do was to maintain the battle line above the ruins. Fortunately, the breach in the city wall was only 10 meters wide, and most of the iron-ranked mercenaries were barely able to stop the undead army that outnumbered them by 100 to 1. In fact, the mercenaries understood this, and they were willing to pay 10 times the amount of blood to repair the breach in the city wall. It was no longer a battle, but a mincemeat that lacked the beauty of battle tactics. The commanders of both sides were like grim reapers, silently adding more lives to the short 10 meters of flesh and blood battlefield. But to Madara's side, the liches could emotionlessly push the skeletons to the center of the table as if they were worthless chips. And this was the most chilling thing for the humans. Crossbowmen in position, reload the blunt arrows. The leaders of the mercenaries acted as heralds at this time. They watched as the experienced warriors unscrewed the corks of the bottles of holy water and poured it on the bundles of arrows. They could not help but feel a little sad. In normal battles, they rarely used these consumables so extravagantly. The warriors raised their four-armed crossbows, aimed, and fired. Then, there was a shrill sound, as if an invisible wall had swept through the rows of skeletons below. The skeletons fell without warning and immediately turned into ashes in the white light. Rabin stepped on a pile of skeletons with one foot and carried his sword on his shoulder with one hand. He had just indifferently replaced the exhausted first team with his second team. Then, he ordered a small mercenary group to carry the wounded down from the city wall. To him, this battle seemed endless, just like the battles he had experienced in Karsuk. Rabin calmly commanded. He knew how far Madara and himself could go. But at this time, he also turned his head and looked up at the flash in the dark sky. His eyes reflected the beam of light, and he smiled. Nobles killing nobles, it's worth the ticket price. But it's the first time I've seen them use methods other than conspiracy, poison, and assassination. That young man is really barbaric. Those nobles are capable of anything, his deputy replied. Rabin glanced at him. You don't understand, he said. Then he asked, how long more? Half an hour, the deputy replied immediately. Rabin waved his hand. Go, put our battle flag higher. After repelling this attack, they will replace the lich. That guy gave me an answer, and now I have to give him an answer. Dawn. The leader of the Firebrand Legion looked at the horizon. Soon. The deputy was slightly stunned. However, Vern smiled and said, this is also the first order of that guy. Of course, we have to act according to the orders of the boss. Boss? Let's think so for now. Rabin looked back at the battlefield. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 239. The main hall of Abi's castle was bustling with activity. Brando, Metisha, the Shire, Scarlet, and the Nightsong Tiger were all gathered together. They watched as the mercenaries carried a huge dusty map out of the basement and placed it on a long table. When the map was placed horizontally on the long table, everyone around the long table couldn't help but sigh softly. However, only the younger of the Wild Elf sisters asked, My lord, how did you know that bastard would put the map in the basement? After she finished speaking, she immediately looked at her elder sister carefully. Fortunately, Furlern didn't look for trouble with her this time and only glared at her in annoyance. In fact, the scene of Brando becoming an elementalist had shocked her to the core, and she was still in a daze. Brando knew that the bastard she was referring to was Grodin, but the once arrogant Baron was currently lying in the courtyard outside. He was not in the mood to collect the scum's corpse, and he might be able to use it in the future. He looked outside the main hall and saw the mercenaries gathering in the inner hall. Other than eliminating the remaining enemies, one of their tasks was to search for Bai Tiamas Chiou, who had escaped. However, Brando knew that Bai Tiamas would not stay in Abi's castle. Even though Bai Tiamas lost miserably in their previous encounter, Bai Tiamas would not do anything meaningless. For example, staying here to give him trouble and vent his anger was not the habit of the Black Knights of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. If it was the Red Knight, Latios, then it would be possible. However, Tiamas would never put himself in danger for no reason. This was one of the reasons why he was the most difficult to deal with among the 4 knights of the Apocalypse. He would not leave any traces that could be used against him. Most of the nobles have the same habits, Tia. Brando replied while thinking, and I don't think Grodin was the one who put this map down. I doubt he has the will to govern this territory. His words were half true and half false. He knew that the map had nothing to do with the nobles' habits, but he knew exactly what was in the basement. Even though he wasn't one of the players who overthrew Grodin, he was still aware of the details of the incident. Brando looked at the map. It was probably a map left behind during the construction of AB's castle. Naturally, it was not Grodin's handiwork. Perhaps it was left behind by the previous generations. The young wizard beside him frowned when he saw the map. This map has at least a few decades of history. The Shire coughed twice and said, doesn't he care about his territory at all? In the territory of the Black Tower Adepts, the Adepts redraw the map every year. Brando shook his head. You think everyone is a wizard? Furthermore, this is Trendheim, the most barbaric region in the whole of Aween. What else can you expect? He swept the dust off the map with his hand and replied, in this era, it's normal for the map of a small city like this to remain unchanged for a few decades. It's barely usable. Besides, we don't need such a detailed map right now. In this era. The Shire frowned and looked at him. You have a habit of saying that. Brando raised his head and rolled his eyes. Do you have a problem with that? No, the young wizard quickly shook his head. It's just that when you say it, my lord, it's filled with a sense of history. When you say it, my lord, you're already standing at the height of history. You're truly wise and mighty. Brando didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Enough with the nonsense. But he suddenly remembered something, right? Lucky hands. No, Falern, where's the equipment I asked you to organize? Ah. The elder of the Wild Elf sisters seemed to have just woken up. She was stunned for a moment and asked, what is it? Cleaning up the battlefield. Oh, Falern was slightly startled. Is it the remains of that skeleton? Speaking of which, there's something strange that I wanted to ask my lord. Something strange. Brando paused for a moment. The equipment dropped by a gold-ranked commander of Madara like Cabia's wouldn't be that bad. However, there were many strange equipment in the Amber Sword. Other than the low-level toys, all of the fantasy-grade and above items were considered small artifacts by the players. That was why he couldn't help but be curious when he heard what Lucky Hand said. But just as he was about to ask, he saw Cornelius, who was sweating profusely, and a young man in a green-gray robe walking into the hall. Seeing the two of them, Brando's expression turned serious and he immediately interrupted Falern's words. He hurriedly asked Cornelius, how is it? We're well rested, my lord. We can set off at any time. Cornelius carefully glanced at him and replied. His words were like a signal, and everyone in the hall picked up their weapons and stood up from their seats. Even Scarlet, who had been chatting with Sifrit, patted her shoulder and stood up. Brando looked at them and nodded, then let's set off. I'll leave Rabin's support to you, Lord Cornelius. I'll have Miss Medisha go with you. What's the situation on the other side? Medisha nodded to Cornelius after hearing Brando's words. Cornelius frowned and shook his head. We've already sent the signal, but there's still no news. I've already sent a scout to contact them, but they won't be back for a while. It's too late, Brando shook his head. We have to set off immediately. But my lord, I know Yuri, Cornelius suddenly said. Even if she doesn't arrive in time, she'll still do her best to delay Madara's undead. My lord, I don't think you need to worry too much. Brando interrupted him before he could finish. It's useless. They won't be able to delay the undead. I know Madara's usual tactics better than all of you. Under the encirclement of the endless skeleton army, unless they are in a defensive position, the 200 to 300 mercenaries are like stones thrown into the sea. In just a moment, they will be reduced to ashes. He placed his hands on the table and looked at everyone, not to mention there's still the necromancers and dark warriors hiding among them. Brando straightened his back and picked up Scarlet's sword. The only thing we can do now is to set off immediately. The only thing left is to pray that Miss Yuta can reach the west gate in time. Otherwise, there's only one outcome. The hall fell silent. Everyone looked at each other, but when they saw that Brendel did not say another word after he finished speaking, he picked up his sword and left his seat. They were stunned for a moment, but they still followed him one by one. At this moment, Seal lifted his head from the dusty map and asked calmly, "So the worst outcome is to give up on Ferber City, right?" "My lord." Everyone was stunned. They didn't understand why the young adept would change the topic to this. But Brando stopped at the door and looked back at him. "What did you think?" "I was just thinking that my lord is as daring as ever." Brando smiled faintly. "Because the price is too high," he replied. "I don't want to lose money. I can only choose the path with the highest returns, even if the risk is higher. But like I said, a dead man won't care if there's 1 or 2 ropes around his neck." "That's true, but now I know that my lord and Miss Roman are a perfect match." Brando smiled. "My lord." The Nightsong Tiger did not understand. "The Shire's words are exactly what I plan to do," Brando nodded. "Not only do I want to kill Grodin, but I also want to claim Tonajol. Count Randner wants to teach me a lesson, and I'll use this land that originally belonged to him to teach him a lesson. Victory or defeat is not only determined by strength, but also by wisdom. No one can win against the future." He stepped out of the door and looked back at the silver-haired middle-aged man who was the only outsider in the hall, besides, who said that a new noble can only have one piece of land. "Don't you agree, Cornelius?" Cornelius was sweating profusely as he looked at Brando in a daze. There was only one thought in his mind: either I'm crazy, or this young man is crazy. He's challenging the traditions of this ancient kingdom and the rules of the game between the nobles. Forcefully invading a noble's land, Martha above. If he succeeds, he'll overturn Erwin's ancient beliefs. The silver-haired middle-aged man lowered his head and thought of another possibility: they've all gone mad. However, the Shire had a different opinion from the mercenary leader. The young magus raised his head and asked without surprise, "But now it seems that the risk is indeed very high. The undead are just outside the city, and if we give up Abes, my lord will lose the excuse to establish a foothold in Tonajol. So, my lord, what do you plan to do? Do you plan to hide in the forest and fight as a guerrilla? By the way, my lord, what did you say about the 16 words you taught me last time?" Brendel smiled faintly and turned his head back. His gaze passed through the large arched door outside the corridor, and it was dark outside. But Brando knew that dawn was only a moment away. Perhaps the sun would rise from the horizon in the next moment. However, could Abes really hold out until the next moment? Man proposes, God disposes. The young man replied, "Since you've chosen the life of a gambler, then you should calm down and enjoy the thrill of a gambler." As for guerrilla warfare, he replied, "Don't worry, I'm also a descendant of a grandmaster. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 240. There are no enemies. There are no enemies on the left either. Those damn skeletons aren't here either. Shouts could be heard on the empty street. Yuta turned around. Her anxious dark green eyes reflected a faint light. Where did those undead go? The mercenary leader's slender fingers pressed on the handle of her rapier. The doubts in her heart were like a fog that gradually spread out. Everyone looked around in this fog, but they couldn't find anything. The mercenaries moved forward in the darkness. Their footsteps were rustling. The unknown was hidden in the silence of the night. Everyone's heart was imperceptibly cold. Fear was like a shadow hanging over everyone's head. It didn't need to speak, but it still grabbed everyone's throats. It was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. Everyone was vigilant with their bright eyes in the dark. They were afraid that the undead, who had suddenly disappeared without a trace, would rush out from an alley and surround them so tightly that not even a drop of water could trickle through. They crossed half of the city. They thought that they would encounter those bloodthirsty undead on the way and then engage in a life-and-death battle. But the enemies seemed to only exist in their imagination. The undead at the west gate didn't seem to exist at all. Could it be that the young noble made a wrong judgment? Yuta turned around. The light from the illuminating crystal in the young man's hand penetrated deep into her eyes, reflecting his pale face due to malnutrition. "Leader?" the young man asked. "What? Could it be that the noble made a wrong judgment?" He whispered, "Could it be that they went around to the north?" "Impossible," the mercenary leader firmly denied this judgment. "Every second counts on the battlefield. The enemy's commander can't be an idiot." "But..." The young man still wanted to say something, but someone in front of them shouted, "Leader!" Both of them were startled and looked in that direction at the same time. "What's wrong?" "I found something," that person shouted. "Come and take a look." Yuta and the young man looked at each other, nodded, and followed. But when she turned the corner, she was stunned. The scene on the long street had completely changed. It was as if a fierce battle had taken place here. As far as the eye could see, there wasn't a single intact stone slab on the ground. All that could be seen were large pits one after another. The cracked stone slabs seemed to have been overturned by some kind of powerful force from the ground. Some of them were even thrown dozens of meters away. If it weren't for the fact that they couldn't feel any elemental disorder caused by the elemental power in the air, everyone present would have reason to believe that there had been at least a battle of gold-tier strength here. Yuta raised her head and saw a two-story building not far away from her. It had caved in and collapsed on one side. It looked as if the center of the building had been hit by something. The wooden beams that supported the structure were all broken. That kind of attack was at least at the level of silver. She took a deep breath and walked forward while looking at the skeletons and human corpses in the pit. "Who are those people?" The female mercenary group leader looked at the corpses and frowned. The corpses were dressed the same as the poor people outside the city. That was easy to explain, but what about the skeletons that were scattered around the corpses? She had observed carefully and found that the casualty ratio was close to 5-1. That meant that there were at least 5 skeletons beside each human corpse. If the poor people outside the city were this strong, Yuta wondered how Groudon was able to survive to this day. The mercenaries shook their heads. "Where are their weapons?" she asked again. "No weapons." The mercenary replied. "No weapons." Yuta took a deep breath. "Are you trying to tell me that these humans fought the undead with their bare hands, or that they are the Silver Folk?" "Leader, I don't know if they are the Silver Folk, but the first thing I want to say is that they are the Silver Folk." The mercenary who called out to them earlier lowered his head and answered softly. Yuta's eyes flashed. The things that happened tonight were beyond her understanding. At this moment, the sound of hooves could be heard from the street. Everyone looked up and saw 2 or 3 riders parting the night mist and stopping in front of them. They were the scouts that were sent out earlier. The female mercenary group leader immediately snapped out of her thoughts and asked, "What's the matter? Did you find anything ahead?" "Leader," the rider immediately replied, "there are sounds of fighting coming from the city gate." "Sounds of fighting coming from the city gate? Does this mean that the refugees pushed the undead back?" Everyone stopped and couldn't help but look at each other. Martha above, what kind of situation is this? The light in the darkness was not as simple as a white paint on a black background. Especially in the deep darkness, the only ray of light seemed to be the hope that flowed in people's hearts. Although they were not illuminated by it, they still wanted to move towards that ray of light. Even if it was just an imagination that existed in the heart, people were willing to trudge towards the direction of light in the darkness. Even if there was a deeper shadow behind them, they were willing to face the light. In the darkness, the light of the torch flickered. The girl quietly knelt in front of the torch. The red light of the torch outlined the soft lines of her cheeks. Between the light and the darkness, the beautiful lines extended to her neck and the shadows under the edge of her face. Her dark eyes reflected the light of the torch, as if there was a flickering flame in the deepest part of her pupils. She quietly pursed her lips and put her hands on her knees, motionless. It was as if everything in front of her had nothing to do with her. With a loud bang, a vine that could only be hugged by two people suddenly rose from the ground. Along with the gravel and soil, it formed a bough and whipped towards the white skeletons under the night sky. The vine, which was dozens of meters long, swept across the sea of skeletons. With a series of crackling sounds, countless broken skeletons were thrown high into the air and swept to the side. 3 tall men wearing animal skin robes with cold expressions stood on the city wall and commanded the vines. It was as if they were cleaning up garbage, and the vines repelled the skeletons that surged up from below again and again. The werewolves who stood beside them, even though they were half hunched over, were a head taller than the 3 men. They stared at the sea of undead with gloomy eyes, ready to repel the sneak attacks of the dark warriors and necromancers hidden among the undead. The battle had lasted for almost an hour. Finally, a tall werewolf walked to the girl's side and bowed his head respectfully. "Miss Amandina, it seems that reinforcements have arrived." Amandina's eyes flashed. "Who are they?" she asked. "They seem to be mercenaries." She turned back to look at the city wall and nodded without saying a word. She gently turned around and saw the merchant lady hugging her precious bag with both hands. Her upper body was completely sprawled on the battlements on the other side. She was sleeping soundly with her eyes closed. Her eyelashes drooped down like thick brushes. Her cheeks were rosy under the light of the fire. She looked so delicate and charming that it would make anyone want to take pity on her. Of course, that was if her mouth was not slightly open, and she was drooling in her sleep in an extremely indecent posture. Amandina sighed a little helplessly and reached out to pat the girl's face. Slap slap. The Roman immediately smacked her lips and waved her hand subconsciously. She muttered softly, "If you want to kill a Roman, please wait until I'm done sleeping." Amandina suddenly felt a sense of exhaustion. "Roman." I know, the little Roman furrowed her eyebrows in her sleep. "Please get a number and line up." Next, Yuta was shocked when she saw Amandina for the first time. The mature female mercenary leader could not help but frown as she looked at the strangely dressed people. The werewolves, druids, and the undead of Westgate were practically useless under their suppression. Not to mention that they were late. Even if they did not come, the outcome of the battle would not have changed at all. But she could not help but wonder who these people were. She did not know if these people were the young noble's subordinates, but if they were, did it mean that he did not trust her at all? Then that young man should have some follow-up measures on Rabin's side. She took a light breath. Even though she knew that this was normal, she still felt a little uncomfortable. It was as if she had made up her mind to work hard but was denied in the end. Even though she was mature and determined, she could not help but feel a little hopeful. Especially after witnessing the young man slaying Grodin with his own hands during the night's battle, she had a faint glimmer of hope in her heart. She hoped that this was an opportunity to change her fate. Not just her, but the entire mercenary group. In this chaotic world, there was never a day of peace. She hoped that the young noble was a lord worth following, at least he could make her subordinates feel a sense of belonging. But nobles were all the same. No matter how different they were, they would only think about how to scheme against others all day long. That was why they were always suspicious of others and did not trust anyone. Even the young noble could not escape from this circle. The female mercenary leader tucked her fiery red hair behind her ears and fell silent at the thought of this. But Amandina raised her head and looked at the woman who was almost a head taller than her. Her expression was calm and did not move, as if she did not want to show any weakness. These should be the mercenaries that the Lord has subdued. She thought about it for a while, and she had a rough idea of what he was thinking. But when she looked at the other party's every move, she suddenly understood. She seemed to have guessed the female mercenary leader's thoughts and asked, "May I ask who you are?" Jana looked at the little girl. Although the other party was much younger than her, she could still feel a faint sense of oppression from her. "Tsk, another noble lass." The female mercenary leader cursed in her heart, but when she opened her mouth, she spoke with a mocking tone. "Jana, leader of the mountain swallow mercenaries, we were sent by his lordship." "Who are you, little girl? Here comes the test." Amandina smiled lightly in her heart, but her expression did not change as she replied, "I am also the Lord's subordinate. To be more precise, I am his chief advisor." She stretched out her hand. "This is a Roman lady, the Lord's fiancée." The merchant girl yawned and rubbed her eyes sleepily. As expected, Yuta's heart skipped a beat. A trace of disgust and disappointment flashed in her eyes. This trace of disappointment and disgust did not escape the noble girl's eyes. As expected, she had the same thought as Yuta, but her expression changed and she replied coldly, "But Miss Yuta, please do not be suspicious. Even though I am here as the Lord's advisor, it does not mean that I agree with his actions." She raised her head and looked at the female mercenary leader with a cold expression. "So, Miss Mercenary Leader, please help me tell the Lord, if he thinks that by being single and abandoning everything, he can avoid harming others, I hope that he can abandon this naivety. Even though I do not know what kind of person the Lord wants to be, I know that a true hero is not a saint who does not make mistakes, but a man who dares to take responsibility. Even if it is a wrong decision, I hope that he understands that a person's life does not only belong to himself, but also to everyone who depends on him, cares for him, and loves him. Just like how I respect the Lord's decision, but I will never forgive him for abandoning his subordinates. Also, please tell him." Amandina suddenly stopped and looked into the distance. "In this world, there is no hope and freedom that can be obtained through charity without bloodshed and struggle." Amandina stopped and her last sentence was transmitted far and wide. A moment later, every werewolf on the city walls turned around and looked at the noble girl with an indescribable light in their eyes. Yuta was slightly taken aback. She looked at the girl and asked, "What do you mean?" Amandina did not answer. There was a dead silence on the city walls. The female mercenary leader looked at the Roman beside her, but the merchant girl only smiled sweetly at her and asked, "Auntie, the Roman wants to ask if you have a signal arrow?" Yuta was stunned. When the signal arrow rose from the west gate, the bright light of the fire illuminated the depths of everyone's eyes. Brando, the Shire, and Scarlet behind him stopped in an instant, and the mercenaries following them also stopped in an instant. Everyone subconsciously raised their heads to look at the resplendent light. It was like a prayer, a blessing, telling everyone on the battlefield. Telling them that they had won. Brando took a deep breath. If he was a gambler, then he would be the luckiest one. This was because the moment the roulette stopped, the needle of fate had precisely opened the door on the only path. As for what was behind the door, he might not be able to see it clearly, but at least he knew that he had won again. He had taken the first move from Madara and Grodin's hands. However, at this moment, Charles turned back to look at his lord. The young wizard smiled and said, "So, after the darkness, it's already the dawn of the world." "My lord." "No, Brando looked at the ray of light and shook his head. It's just that, I can already see the ending. Author's note, the last chapter of the Dusty Kingdom. It took some time to come up with this chapter, so I'm going to take a break after the explosion to think about the next chapter. I'm going to have to deal with the double monthly votes that are coming soon. Sigh. May the round God bless me, Godi Sagral. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.